There is a place in Britain where the ground hums. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but actually measurably hums. A low resonance that modern instruments can detect but not fully explain. People have been feeling it for thousands of years. Some of them built circles of stone around the spot. Some of them dug chambers into the earth directly below it. And some of them, the ones we call the Druids, the most famous priests in the ancient world, arrived on the scene and found something already there, so old, so strange, and so deeply embedded in the land that they chose not to confront it or replace it. They chose instead to whisper about it, to walk carefully around its edges, and to push certain knowledge underground where ordinary people could not reach it. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know. Where are you right now and what time is it? I always read the comments, and it never stops being remarkable. Someone watching from a flat in Edinburgh at 2 in the morning. Someone lying in a field in Devon with their phone propped against a fence post. Someone in New Zealand who stumbled across ancient Britain from the other side of the world. Wherever you are tonight, you are about to go somewhere much older. The history books give us the Druids and stop there. They present these robed figures as the beginning of British spiritual life, as if the island were blank before they arrived. But Britain was never blank. It was never empty. And the things that were here before the Druids are the things that even the Druids found unsettling. What we are going to talk about tonight is not a single monument or a single theory. It is a pattern, a shape that keeps reappearing across thousands of years of British prehistory, a shape that suggests something was happening in this landscape that nobody has fully named and nobody has fully explained. And the deeper you go into it, the quieter the experts get. Let us begin at the beginning, not with Stonehenge, because everyone begins with Stonehenge, and in doing so they miss everything that came before it. Let us begin, instead, with a smell. In 1966, a team of archaeologists cutting into a chalk ridge in Wiltshire discovered something that stopped them cold. Beneath a layer of grass roots and topsoil, beneath centuries of accumulated earth, they found a deposit of organic material so ancient that the dating results came back and had to be checked twice. The material was charred, compressed, and mixed with what appeared to be deliberately arranged fragments of human bone. It was over 10,000 years old. 10,000 years. That places it at the very edge of the Mesolithic period, the Middle Stone Age, a time when Britain was still connected to continental Europe by a land bridge, a time when the English Channel did not yet exist. And someone was already doing something ceremonial in the landscape that would eventually become Wiltshire. Someone was already choosing specific places in the land and marking them with fire and bone. The archaeologists did not know what to make of it. Their working models for British prehistory had no room for ceremonial behaviour that old. The assumption had always been that spiritual or ritual activity came later, after farming, after settlement, after the development of complex social structures. But here was evidence that people who still moved with the seasons, people who hunted red deer and gathered hazelnuts from the edges of retreating ice, were already doing something in the ground that looked very much like worship. That discovery was quietly filed away. It did not make the front pages. It did not appear in school textbooks. And for decades, it sat in the margins of the academic literature, acknowledged in footnotes, mentioned in passing, but never really examined for what it might mean. Because what it might mean is uncomfortable. It might mean that the spiritual relationship between the people of Britain and their landscape is not thousands of years old. It might be tens of thousands of years old. And if that is true, then everything we think we know about where British sacred tradition begins has to be thrown out and started again. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. Let us follow the trail carefully, because this is not a story that rewards rushing. The land itself has a memory. That is not a mystical statement. It is a geological one. The chalk downlands of southern England, the limestone hills of the Cotswolds, the granite uplands of Cornwall and Dartmoor, These are ancient formations, and they have been shaping human movement across Britain for as long as humans have been here. The chalk is particularly important. Chalk is soft enough to carve, but hard enough to hold its shape for millennia. Water moves through it in ways that are almost invisible from the surface, but create vast networks of underground movement beneath your feet. And chalk glows in moonlight. Anyone who has walked the Wiltshire Downs on a clear night knows this. The ground itself seems to emit a faint luminescence, a pale reflection of starlight that turns the landscape into something genuinely otherworldly. The earliest people who moved through this landscape almost certainly noticed all of this. They were not primitive in any meaningful sense of that word. Their brains were identical to yours. Their capacity for observation, for pattern recognition, for drawing meaning from natural phenomena was every bit as sophisticated as anything a modern scientist brings to a field site. The difference is not intelligence. The difference is knowledge base. They did not have the names for what they were seeing, but they were seeing it with full human awareness, and what they saw shaped everything that came after. Around 9,000 years ago, as the ice retreated and the land began to warm and green, something interesting started happening in several places across southern Britain. Simultaneously, people began to build, not houses, not granaries, not the practical structures of survival, but something else. Elongated mounds of earth, carefully shaped, oriented along specific lines, placed in positions that seemed to have been chosen with considerable care. Archaeologists call them long barrows, and they are the oldest human constructions in Britain. The oldest ones predate Stonehenge by thousands of years. Some of them predate agriculture. Some of them were being built by people who were still primarily hunters and gatherers, people who had no permanent settlements, no pottery, no metal tools of any kind. Think about that for a moment. These are people who had no fixed homes. They moved with the seasons and the animals, and yet they chose to build permanent structures in the land, permanent marks. Not to live in, not to store food in, but to place their dead. And not just any dead, selected dead, specific individuals, fragments of specific bones, arranged in specific ways inside specific chambers. The chambers inside long barrows are remarkable things. You can still enter some of them. There is one on the Cotswold Plateau called Belus Knapp, and if you squeeze through its low entrance and sit inside the stone-lined chamber in the dark, you experience something that is very difficult to describe rationally. The chamber is small, perhaps 4 meters long, perhaps 2 meters wide. The walls are dry stacked limestone, fitted without mortar, still solid after 5,000 years. The ceiling is a single massive capstone, and the acoustics are extraordinary. Any sound you make inside the chamber reverberates in a way that is completely unlike the outside world. A low hum, a whisper, a drum beat, all of these sounds bounce and multiply in a way that feels almost architectural, as if the chamber was designed specifically to alter sound, to create an acoustic environment that was qualitatively different from ordinary space. Researchers have studied the acoustics of megalithic chambers across Britain and Ireland, and the findings are consistent. These chambers were not accidentally resonant. The people who built them understood something about how sound behaves inside enclosed stone spaces, and they appear to have deliberately engineered that quality into their construction. Why would you engineer specific acoustics into a tomb? The obvious answer, if you are willing to entertain it, is that these spaces were not primarily tombs. They were places for something else, something that the bones of the dead were brought to witness or to participate in, something that required the kind of altered perception that resonant sound can produce in the human nervous system. This is where the mainstream archaeologists start to get uncomfortable, and it is also where the story gets genuinely interesting. There is a concept in the study of ancient religion called the sacred landscape. The idea is that pre-modern peoples did not experience their environment the way we experience ours. We move through the landscape as a background, as a context for our activities. They move through it as an active participant, as something with its own intentions, its own voice, its own relationship to the human community. The land was not a setting, it was a character, and certain places in the land were understood to be places where the membrane between the ordinary world and whatever lay behind it was thinner than elsewhere. Every ancient culture on Earth has identified such places. The Greeks had their oracles, their sacred springs and chasms. The Romans had their sacred groves. Indigenous cultures across the Americas, across Africa, across the Pacific, all of them have traditions of specific places in the landscape where contact with something beyond ordinary experience is possible. The idea is universal enough that it is probably not a cultural invention. It is probably a response to something real, something that human nervous systems, tuned by millions of years of evolution to be extraordinarily sensitive to their environment, actually perceive in certain locations. In Britain, those places were identified very early, and the people who identified them did not immediately build monuments. First, they watched. First, they learned. And they transmitted that learning in ways that required no writing, because in a culture without writing, the way you preserve knowledge is by embedding it in landscape. You choose a stone, you orient a mound, you align an entrance to catch the light at a specific moment of the year. You build a memory into the land itself, so that future generations walking through that land will re-encounter the knowledge without needing to be explicitly taught it. This is one of the most sophisticated ideas in all of human intellectual history, and it was being practiced in Britain at least 7,000 years ago. The people who built the long barrows were not a single culture. Britain, in the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age that began around 4000 BCE, was inhabited by several overlapping populations with different origins, different traditions, and apparently different relationships to the landscape. Some came from continental Europe, bringing farming and cattle and a tradition of building with stone. Others were the descendants of the much older Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who had been in Britain for thousands of years before the first farmer arrived. And these two traditions, the new and the old, appear to have merged in the landscape in ways that created something neither of them had alone. The long barrows are the product of that merger. The farming tradition brought the know-how for working with earth and stone at scale. The older tradition brought the knowledge of the land, the accumulated understanding of which places had power and why, the geography of the sacred that had been building in Britain for thousands of years before the first Neolithic monument was constructed. What that older tradition actually believed, what they actually understood about the places they considered powerful, we cannot know directly. They left no texts. They left no explicit iconography. What they left was position. The long barrows are positioned in the landscape in ways that can only be understood if you spend time in that landscape, walking it, watching it across multiple seasons, attending to how light moves across it, and how sound behaves in it, and how water flows through it. When you do that, patterns emerge that are invisible from above, patterns that are invisible on a map, patterns that only reveal themselves to someone moving through the terrain on foot, at the pace of a human body, at the scale of a human life. And those patterns suggest that the people who chose the locations of these monuments were working with a model of the landscape that we have almost entirely lost. Let us go to a specific place. Let us go to Avebury. Avebury is not as famous as Stonehenge. It does not appear on as many postcards. It does not attract quite as many tourists. But among the people who study British prehistory, seriously, among the archaeologists and the archaeoastronomers and the landscape historians, Avebury is understood to be something considerably more significant than Stonehenge. Not more impressive in the obvious visual sense, not more photogenic, but more complex, more layered, more ancient in its origins, and more deeply woven into the broader sacred landscape of Wiltshire, in ways that suggest an intentionality that goes far beyond the placing of a circle of stones. Avebury is a henge. A henge is a roughly circular earthwork consisting of a bank and a ditch. The peculiar thing about henges, and it is pointed out in the archaeological literature, but rarely explained satisfactorily, is that the bank is on the outside and the ditch is on the inside. If you were building a defensive structure, you would do it the other way around. You would put the ditch outside and the bank inside, so that attackers had to cross the ditch before they could approach the wall. The fact that every henge in Britain has the bank on the outside suggests that henges were not defensive structures. They were enclosures designed to keep something in rather than to keep anything out, or more precisely, designed to define and mark the boundary of a sacred space, a space within which different rules applied. The henge at Avebury is enormous. It is the largest stone circle complex in the world. The outer bank and ditch enclose an area of roughly 11.5 hectares, which means it is large enough to contain the entire village of Avebury. Within its boundaries, roads and pubs and farmhouses and all. The ditch alone was originally 9 meters deep and 20 meters wide, carved from solid chalk using nothing but antler picks and ox shoulder blades. The effort required to create it is essentially incomprehensible by modern standards. Estimates suggest that the construction of the Avebury henge required something in the range of 1.5 million man-hours of labour. For a society without metal tools, without wheeled transport, without any form of mechanization, that represents a social organization and a collective commitment to a single project that dwarfs almost anything in the ancient world. And it was not built all at once. The monument at Avebury was constructed in phases over at least 1,000 years, from roughly 3000 BCE to roughly 2000 BCE. Different generations added to it, modified it, oriented new features in relation to existing ones. There are 2 smaller circles inside the main enclosure, each of them large enough to be a significant monument on its own. There are avenues of standing stones leading away from the main complex across the landscape, connecting Avebury to other sites, to other monuments, to other places in the landscape that were considered significant. The whole thing is not a monument in the modern sense. It is a project, an ongoing act of collective meaning-making that spanned dozens of generations and hundreds of years. But what is most striking about Avebury, the thing that takes your breath away when you actually stand inside the henge and look at what surrounds you, is the stones themselves. The sarsen stones of Avebury are not the neatly shaped trilithons of Stonehenge. They are rough, organic, wildly varied in shape and size. Some of them are tall and thin. Some are broad and roughly triangular. Some have surfaces that are almost sculpturally complex, planes and facets that catch light differently at different times of day. And some of them, if you look at them in the right light, in the low amber light of a winter afternoon or the cool blue of an early summer dawn, appear to have faces. Not carved faces, not deliberate representations, but the kind of accidental but unmistakable suggestions of faces that the human visual system cannot help but find in complex natural forms. The people who chose these stones chose them from locations across a wide area. The sarsen stones of Wiltshire are a natural geological feature, sandstone blocks left stranded on the chalk downs by glacial action. But they are found across a wide territory, and the builders of Avebury were clearly selective about which ones they wanted. They were not simply taking the nearest available stones. They were travelling across the landscape, evaluating individual stones and choosing specific ones. The question of what criteria guided that selection is one that archaeologists have not been able to fully answer. Mass and transportability are obvious factors, but some of the choices seem to go beyond those practical considerations, seem to reflect an interest in the natural character of specific stones, their shape, their surface texture, the way light plays across them. This is consistent with what we know about the worldview of pre-modern peoples worldwide. Stones were not inert in such worldviews. They were entities with their own histories, their own natures, their own place in the web of relationships that constituted the living world. Moving a specific stone from its natural location to a new position in the landscape was not merely a physical act. It was a social act, a relational act, something more akin to inviting a person to take up residence in a new community than to transporting building material. And the placement of that stone in relation to other stones, in relation to the landscape, in relation to the movements of the sun and moon and stars, all of that was part of the meaning that was being created. Avebury was not a monument expressing a pre-existing belief. It was a physical system that generated meaning through the relationships it created. Now here is the thing that took researchers a long time to fully grasp, and that still does not have an adequate explanation. Avebury does not stand alone. It is the centre of a landscape that was comprehensively modified over a period of at least 2,000 years. Within a roughly 10-mile radius of the main henge, there are dozens of other monuments, other henges, other stone circles, other avenues, other long barrows, other pit complexes and timber enclosures and processional routes. And they are not randomly distributed. They are organized. They relate to each other. And they relate to features of the natural landscape, to ridgelines and watercourses and views, and the positions of sunrise and sunset on significant dates, in ways that suggest the whole complex was conceived as a system, not as a collection of individual monuments built independently by different communities for different purposes. The most extraordinary component of this system is not Avebury itself. It is a place called Silbury Hill, which stands about a mile south of the main henge, and which is the largest prehistoric man-made mound in Europe. Silbury Hill is 39 metres tall. Its base covers an area of over 2 hectares. It was constructed in several phases beginnings around 2400 BCE, and the total volume of material moved to create it is estimated at somewhere in the region of 500,000 cubic meters of chalk and earth. It took, by some estimates, a workforce of several hundred people working continuously for decades to build it. And nobody knows what it is for. That is not an exaggeration. That is the actual state of the scholarly conversation about Silbury Hill. There is no consensus, no even dominant theory that has withstood serious scrutiny about why this enormous structure was built. Excavations have been conducted at various points in the past 3 centuries. There is no burial chamber inside it, unlike the long barrows. There are no significant artifacts associated with its construction or use. It does not obviously align with any astronomical phenomenon in the way that many other prehistoric monuments do. It does not appear to have served any practical function. It is simply there, enormous and enigmatic, in the middle of the most intensively monumentalized prehistoric landscape in Britain. One of the more interesting observations made by landscape researchers is that Silbury Hill, viewed from certain positions in the surrounding landscape, appears to mimic the shape of the natural hills visible on the horizon. The Marlborough Downs to the north, the chalk ridges to the east and south, they have a particular profile when seen from the valley floor, and Silbury Hill seems to echo that profile, as if the monument is not just a structure in the landscape, but a statement about the relationship between the human-made and the natural, a blurring of the distinction between what people build and what the earth itself produces. There is another observation that is less frequently discussed, but that strikes many people who visit the site in the right season, in late July or early August, when the water table is high and the surrounding land is wet. When you stand on the flat top of Silbury Hill and look down at the ground around its base, you can sometimes see the hill reflected in standing water that pools around its perimeter. The reflection creates an image of the hill extending downward into the earth as deep as the visible hill extends upward into the sky. And the effect, if you have any visual imagination at all, is of a structure that exists simultaneously above and below the ground, reaching in both directions with equal force. This is not an accident. The positioning of Silbury Hill in relation to the local water table appears to have been deliberate. The builders understood the hydrology of the site and chose their location specifically because of it. And the image it creates of a monument reaching downward into the earth as much as upward into the sky points towards something important about the worldview these people held. For them, depth was not just physical depth. The space below the ground was not just soil and rock and water, it was the other direction. The direction you go when you die. The direction that ancestors travel in. The direction from which life emerges. From seeds pressing upward through dark earth. From water rising through chalk and emerging as springs. The underworld was not a concept borrowed from later classical mythology. It was a direct response to observable reality. Things go down and come back. Seeds go down. Rain goes down. The sun goes down. And things come up. Plants come up. Springs come up. The sun comes up. The cyclic movement between above and below, between the visible world and the hidden world, was not a theological speculation. It was an observed fact of life in an agrarian landscape. And the monuments of the Avebury landscape encode this observation in stone and earth on a scale that is almost impossible to fully take in. They are not just marking sacred places in the horizontal landscape. They are marking the vertical axis, the connection between above and below, between sky and underworld, between the living and the dead, and they are marking it with an insistence that speaks to how absolutely central that axis was to everything these people understood about the world. This is the tradition that predates the Druids. This is what was already here when the cultural and intellectual movement we call Druidry emerged, somewhere around the middle of the first millennium BCE. Roughly 2,500 years after the last of the great Neolithic monuments of Avebury and Stonehenge were built. And now we need to talk about the gap. Because there is a gap between the end of the Great Building Period, around 1500 BCE, when the last major modifications were made to monuments like Stonehenge and Avebury, and the emergence of Druidry as a recognizable cultural tradition, there are roughly 1,000 years. A millennium of British prehistory, about which we know relatively little. The Bronze Age and the Early Iron Age, the period from roughly 1500 BCE to roughly 500 BCE, are periods of British history that are documented archaeologically, but are much less richly documented than what comes before or after. What we do know is that during this period, the great monument complexes of the Neolithic were no longer being built. In fact, many of them appear to have been deliberately modified, perhaps decommissioned in ways that suggest a significant cultural shift. Some long barrows were sealed, some stone circles had their stones rearranged or removed. The tradition of building these elaborate ceremonial landscapes seems to have faded, replaced by a different kind of sacred practice, more portable, more personal, less invested in the permanent reshaping of the landscape. But here is what did not fade: the landscape itself. The sacred geography that had been established over thousands of years of Neolithic and early Bronze Age construction was still there. The hills and the springs and the ridgelines and the views were still where they had always been. The monuments, even the ones no longer actively used, were still visible. And the knowledge of what these places meant, the understanding of why they had been built and what had been understood about the landscape before the building began, that knowledge did not simply disappear. It went somewhere. It went underground. Not metaphorically, literally underground. There is a tradition in pre-Roman British culture, documented by classical sources and supported by archaeological evidence, of hiding things in bogs, in rivers, in pits, in watery places. This tradition is called, in the scholarly literature, votive deposition. the practice of deliberately placing valuable objects in locations where they cannot easily be retrieved as offerings to powers associated with those locations. But there is another tradition, documented less clearly but present in the evidence, of hiding knowledge itself, of burying not objects but understanding, of taking certain categories of information and making them deliberately inaccessible to casual inquiry. The Druids, as described by classical writers who knew them or who recorded accounts of them, were the embodiment of this tradition. Julius Caesar's account of the Druids, written in the 1st century BCE, describes them as a priestly class, whose most closely guarded knowledge was transmitted entirely orally, never written down. Caesar suggests that the memorization required was so extensive that some Druids spent 20 years in training before they were considered fully initiated. The oral transmission was not simply a practical expedient in a culture without writing, because by Caesar's time, writing was widely known in the Celtic world. It was a deliberate choice. The knowledge was kept unwritten specifically to prevent it from spreading beyond the boundaries of those who were trusted to hold it. What was that knowledge? Caesar gives us a partial account. He mentions that the Druids taught the nature of the gods, the powers of the immortal soul, the movements of the stars and heavens, the dimensions of the earth and of the world, the strength and power of the immortal gods, and a body of natural philosophy. He also mentions, in an almost throwaway phrase, that they taught many things concerning the stars and their motion, concerning the size of the universe and of the earth, concerning the nature of things, and concerning the power and majesty of the immortal gods. That phrase, the nature of things, is a significant one. In the intellectual tradition of the ancient Mediterranean world, the nature of things, in Latin, the natura rerum, was the subject of the most serious philosophical inquiry. It meant cosmology. It meant the deep structure of reality. It meant the relationship between the material and the immaterial, between the visible and the invisible, between the temporal and the eternal. Caesar is saying, in his characteristic military administrator's shorthand, that the Druids were doing philosophy, serious philosophy, philosophy of a kind comparable to what the Greeks were doing in their academies and the Romans were beginning to do in their villas, and they were doing it in a tradition that was explicitly rooted in the landscape of Britain. The Greek writer Diodorus Siculus, writing slightly earlier than Caesar, describes the Druids in a way that connects them specifically to a tradition of sacred geography. He mentions that the Hyperboreans, a people associated in Greek mythology with the far north, possibly with Britain, had a circular temple from which, every 19 years, when the stars returned to their original positions, a god would descend and play a lyre and dance all night until the rising of the Pleiades. The 19-year cycle is a real astronomical phenomenon, the Metonic cycle, a period after which the phases of the moon return to the same relationship with the solar calendar. The Pleiades are a real star cluster whose rising and setting were used by agricultural societies across the ancient world to mark seasonal transitions. And the circular temple, the place where this astronomical event was richly marked, is almost certainly Stonehenge. This is not speculation. Stonehenge is in Britain. It is circular, and it is oriented with extraordinary precision to the movements of the sun and moon in a way that the 19-year Metonic cycle would have been observable and significant. The Greek sources are placing the most significant astronomical ritual in the ancient world at a site in Britain and describing it in terms that connect it directly to a tradition of landscape knowledge that is much older than the Druids themselves. The Druids did not create this tradition. They inherited it, and they appear to have understood, with considerable clarity, that they were custodians of something they had not originated. There are accounts in medieval Irish literature, which preserves much older oral traditions, of a category of knowledge called imbas forosnai, sometimes translated as wisdom that illuminates. This was a specific kind of knowledge held by a specific class of people, knowledge that was not acquired through ordinary learning, but through a particular kind of experience, a direct encounter with the hidden structure of things. It was associated with certain places, certain states of consciousness, and certain practices of attention and intention that could create the conditions for that encounter. The people who held this knowledge were not ordinary priests performing ordinary rituals. They were specialists in a very particular kind of perception, a mode of awareness that operated in the boundary zone between the ordinary world and what lay beyond it, and they understood themselves as connected to a lineage of people who had held similar knowledge going back to a time before any living memory. The long barrows were part of that lineage. The people who built them, who placed selected bones in carefully acoustic chambers oriented towards specific points on the horizon, were practicing something recognizable as a forerunner of the tradition the Druids would inherit 2,000 years later. But there is something even older than the long barrows, and this is where the story becomes genuinely strange. In several locations across Britain, there is evidence of practices that predate the Neolithic by thousands of years. Evidence that the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who roamed Britain before farming arrived were already doing something with the landscape that bears a recognizable family resemblance to what came later. Not building monuments, because they were mobile and monument building requires a commitment to place that doesn't fit with a nomadic lifestyle. But marking places, returning to specific places repeatedly across multiple generations, leaving specific traces in specific locations. At a place called Starcar in Yorkshire, which is one of the most intensively studied Mesolithic sites in Europe, archaeologists excavating a site dating to around 9000 BCE found something that takes some time to fully absorb. They found antler headdresses. Specifically, they found 21 red deer skulls that had been carefully modified, their antlers preserved, but their weight reduced by removing sections of bone in a way that would make them wearable as headdresses. They were found in what appears to have been a specific ritual deposit at the edge of a now dried lake, 9000 BCE. The Druids were writing their philosophy in the first millennium BCE. The gap between Starcar and the Druids is 8,000 years. 8,000 years of continuous tradition in which specific objects, specifically antler headdresses representing the most powerful animals of the landscape, were being used in specific practices at specific places. The same objects appear in the iconography of Gaulish and British Celtic art from the Iron Age. The antlered figure, half human and half deer, appears on the Gundestrup cauldron, one of the most significant ritual objects of the Celtic world, found in a Danish bog and dated to around 100 BCE. From 9000 BCE to 100 BCE is 9,000 years. But the image endures, the antlered figure, the person who is both human and animal, the one who stands in the boundary between the ordinary world and the wild world, between the human community and the non-human landscape. This figure does not disappear in the transition from Mesolithic to Neolithic to Bronze Age to Iron Age. It goes underground, it becomes hidden knowledge, it travels in the memory of specific people who are trusted to carry it forward until the time is right for it to be known again. This is the lineage that frightened the Druids, not because it was malevolent, not because it was dangerous in any simple sense, but because it was old in a way that was genuinely humbling. The Druids, for all their sophistication, for all their astronomical knowledge and their philosophical depth and their 20 years of training, were relative newcomers in a landscape that had been holding sacred knowledge for longer than they could easily trace. And the places where that knowledge was oldest and deepest were places that had a power to them that was not amenable to the kind of systematic categorization that Druidic training was built around. There are places in the British landscape that have been sacred continuously since before the Neolithic, Springs, mostly. Springs have a particular quality in the pre-modern understanding of sacred geography. They are places where something comes up from below, where the underworld expresses itself in the surface world, where the hidden world becomes visible, and in the chalk and limestone landscapes of Britain, springs are plentiful and often strikingly beautiful, emerging as clear cold water from apparent bare rock, appearing to come from nowhere, with no obvious source on the surface above. The spring at what is now Bath was one of these places. Long before the Romans arrived and built their famous baths, long before the Celts dedicated the spring to their goddess Sulis, there was a tradition of interaction with that spring that the archaeological evidence suggests goes back to the Bronze Age at minimum and possibly much further. Objects have been found in the deposits around the spring that date to before the Iron Age, before the period in which Druidic practice is attested. Objects that were clearly deliberately placed there, clearly offered to whatever power was understood to inhabit the spring, in a tradition that the later Celtic and then Roman use of the site directly inherits and overlays. The Romans, famously practical and syncretic in their religious policy, did not try to suppress the tradition of the spring. They built around it. They created a monumental structure that acknowledged the power of the place while domesticating it, making it accessible and manageable and safe. The Celtic practitioners before them had done something similar, naming the power of the spring and giving it a form and a story that their community could work with. And before them, the people of the Bronze Age and the Neolithic had done the same thing, in their own terms, with their own understanding, placing the spring within a broader sacred geography that acknowledged its importance while connecting it to everything else they understood about the world. What none of them did, in all of these thousands of years, was ignore it. Not one culture that encountered this spring chose to walk away from it. Not one tradition that inherited the landscape chose to treat it as ordinary ground. Something about that place demanded engagement. Something about it refused to be simply passed by. The Druids knew this about such places. They knew it in a specific and technical sense. Their understanding of sacred geography, which the classical sources tell us was an important part of their cosmological teaching, included a detailed knowledge of places in the landscape where the ordinary rules did not apply, where perception could shift, where knowledge that was normally inaccessible could become available. And these places were not places they had identified through their own observation. They were places that had been known and marked and used for long before Druidic culture existed. The Druids inherited a map of the sacred landscape of Britain that had been drawn over thousands of years by people whose names are lost and whose languages we cannot reconstruct and whose specific beliefs we can only infer from the physical traces they left in the earth. That map was carried in memory. It was carried in the oral traditions that Druidic training preserved so carefully. It was carried in the landscape itself, in the monuments and the alignments and the place names that encoded geographical knowledge in forms that could survive the loss of the specific cultural context that originally created them. And it pointed, again and again, toward a quality of the British landscape that had been recognized from the very beginning of human habitation of these islands. The British landscape is strange, not in a way that ordinary tourists notice necessarily, not in a way that shows up in guidebooks or appears on scenic lookout signs, but strange in a way that you feel in your body when you spend time in it. Strange in a way that the people who built the long barrows and the henges and the stone circles clearly felt, because they spent enormous amounts of time and energy and social coordination in response to that feeling. Strange in a way that the Druids felt when they described it in their cosmological teachings. Strange in a way that has continued to draw people to these places for 10,000 years, despite the absence of any practical reason to visit a grassy mound on a chalk hill or a circle of weathered stones on an exposed upland. What is that strangeness? It is very difficult to articulate without sounding like you are making claims that are not supportable. But let us try, carefully. The landscape of Britain sits at a particular latitude, in a particular relationship to the Atlantic Ocean, under a particular pattern of weather and light that produces qualities of illumination and atmosphere that are genuinely unusual. The quality of light in Britain is not like the light of the Mediterranean or the light of continental Europe. It changes extraordinarily rapidly. In the space of an hour on a typical British day, you might move through a dozen different light conditions, from deep shadow to brilliant clarity to soft diffusion to dramatic contrast and back again. The sky is active in Britain in a way that does not characterize skies in more stable climates. And the land, especially the chalk and limestone uplands, responds to that active sky in ways that create visual experiences that are hard to categorize. Add to this the extraordinary number of springs and streams and rivers that emerge from the chalk and limestone, the constant sound and presence of moving water, even in relatively dry conditions, the frequency of mist in valleys and on hills, the way that certain atmospheric conditions can make familiar landscapes appear completely transformed, and you begin to understand why these people chose this landscape as the location of their deepest sacred investment. The land kept doing things, it kept presenting phenomena that demanded response. And the response, accumulated over thousands of years by people who were paying close attention, became a tradition of remarkable sophistication. The Druids were the most recent and in some ways the most articulate expression of that tradition, but they were not the source of it, and in their better moments, their wiser and more honest moments, they acknowledged this. The classical sources describe Druidic teaching as including detailed knowledge of the origins of the world, of the nature of time, of the relationship between the present moment and what the Druids called the Great Time, the time before human memory. And they describe the Druids as understanding themselves to be custodians of that older knowledge rather than its creators. There is a particular Druidic concept that is relevant here, the concept of the nemeton. This is a Celtic word that is usually translated as sacred grove, and it is true that nemeton refers, in most of its usages, to a specific type of natural location, typically a grove of trees, that was considered sacred and that was used for religious ceremonies. But the concept is richer than that translation suggests. A nemeton was not sacred because it had been made sacred by human ritual. It was sacred because it was already sacred, because it had a quality that preceded and exceeded anything that human beings had done with it. The ritual that took place there was not creating the sacredness. It was responding to it. This distinction matters enormously. If you believe that sacred places are made sacred by human action, then the history of sacred places is the history of human culture and nothing more. But if you believe, as the Druids clearly did, that some places have a quality that is inherent and non-negotiable, that no amount of human ritual can create it, and no amount of neglect can destroy it, then the history of sacred places is not just the history of human culture. It is the history of an ongoing relationship between human beings and something in the landscape that is genuinely other. The Druids believed the latter, and the evidence suggests that the tradition they inherited, the Neolithic and Bronze Age traditions that preceded them, believed it too. The long barrows were not placed arbitrarily. The henges were not located randomly. The stone circles were not built wherever the nearest available stone happened to be. Every monument in the British prehistoric landscape was placed in response to a perception that that specific location had a quality that made it the right place for what was being built. The monument was not creating the sacred site. It was marking it, responding to it, making it visible and accessible to the community that needed to interact with it. This is the tradition that predates the Druids. This is what scared them, not in the sense of terrifying them, but in the sense of filling them with awe, because the places where that tradition was oldest and most intense were places where the human community's relationship to the landscape was so ancient and so deep that no amount of systematic philosophy could fully account for it. And so the Druids went underground with the deepest of it. They kept it in their oral traditions, in their carefully guarded teachings, in the 20-year initiation process that ensured only those with the capacity and the commitment could access the full depth of what had been accumulated, not because they wanted to exclude, but because they understood that some things need protection. Some knowledge, once widely distributed to people who don't have the framework to receive it correctly, becomes distorted, becomes simplified, becomes harmless and thereby useless. The underground tradition was not hidden out of selfishness. It was hidden out of care, out of respect for the knowledge itself, out of an understanding that certain things remain powerful only when they remain in relationship with people who can hold them properly. Now let us go deeper. Let us follow the trail into the specific content of what was being hidden and why. There is a body of medieval Welsh and Irish literature that most people have never read, and that most people who have heard of it think of as mythology, as folklore, as entertaining stories about gods and heroes with no particular relevance to anything real. The Mabinogion, the Lebor Gabala Erin, the Cathmage Tuired. These texts, written down in the medieval period but preserving oral traditions of considerable antiquity, contain within them, if you know how to read them, something that looks very much like encoded geographical and cosmological knowledge. The medieval Irish texts in particular describe the arrival of several successive waves of settlers in Ireland, each one with specific characteristics and specific powers. The last of these waves before the arrival of the Gaels, the people who became the historical Irish, is the Tuatha De Danann, the tribe of the goddess Danu. The Tuatha De Danann are described as beings of great beauty and power, skilled in arts and crafts and magic and warfare, who arrived in Ireland from 4 cities in the north of the world and who brought with them 4 sacred objects: a stone that screamed when the true King of Ireland stood on it, a sword from which no one who was struck could escape, a spear that always returned to the thrower, and a cauldron from which no one ever went away hungry. These 4 objects are almost certainly symbolic of something. They represent 4 powers or principles that the Tuatha De Danann embody, and the 4 cities from which they came, cities with names like Phalias, Angorius, and Phineas, and Murias, are understood by some scholars to be not literal places but symbolic locations, perhaps 4 cardinal directions or 4 cosmological principles. But there is another way to read this literature, and it is a way that some scholars of Celtic mythology have begun to take seriously. The stories of the Tuatha De Danann, the descriptions of their cities and their powers and their relationship to the landscape of Ireland, may be encoded descriptions of actual historical events. Events from a period of Irish prehistory so distant that direct narrative transmission is impossible, but that can still be transmitted if you wrap the knowledge in story form that is memorable and stable across thousands of years of oral tradition. On this reading, the Tuatha De Danann are a memory of the people who built the great Neolithic monuments of Ireland, the passage tombs of the Boyne Valley, the complex of ritual monuments in the Shannon Estuary, the stone circles and standing stones and portal dolmens that mark the Irish landscape in ways that parallel the marking of the British landscape. These were people of great sophistication, great knowledge, great organizational capacity. They left in the landscape evidence of an understanding of astronomy and geometry and sacred geography that remains impressive even by modern standards. And then they disappeared from the historical record, absorbed by or displaced by later populations. Their specific cultural identity lost, but their knowledge preserved, imperfectly and indirectly, in the stories that the people who came after told about them. The Druids knew these stories. They were part of the oral tradition that Druidic training preserved, and the Druids understood them not simply as mythology, but as a compressed historical record, as encoded information about a time when the relationship between human beings and the sacred landscape was even more direct and more powerful than anything the Druids themselves could achieve. This is the deep structure of what was going underground. The Druids were preserving memories of a time when sacred knowledge was not a specialist possession, but a general condition of human life in this landscape. A time when the boundary between the ordinary world and whatever lies behind it was thin enough that contact was not exceptional, but routine. A time when the landscape itself was alive in a way that required no special training to perceive. They knew they were not in that time. They knew the boundary had thickened. They knew the direct perception that had been available to the builders of the Long Barrows was no longer available to ordinary people in the Iron Age landscape. And they understood their role as custodians of knowledge that pointed toward that older time and prepared the way for whatever might come after. The question that haunted them, the question that drives the hidden tradition underground in every culture where it appears, is whether what was lost can be recovered. Whether the thickening of the boundary is permanent or temporary. Whether the time of more direct perception will return. The Druidic answer to this question is embedded in one of the most consistent features of their cosmological teaching, as described by the classical sources. The Druids taught that time was cyclical, not in the simple sense that seasons repeat and years follow years, but in a much larger sense, in the sense that entire ages of the world succeed one another in a cycle, each age with its own character and its own relationship between human consciousness and the sacred, and that the current age, which the Druids experienced as a time of increasing distance from the sacred, would give way eventually to a new age in which that distance would diminish again. This is not a uniquely Celtic teaching. The same doctrine of world ages appears in the Hindu tradition, in the Norse tradition, in the Zoroastrian tradition, in various Native American traditions, and in numerous others. It is one of the most widespread religious ideas in the world, but in the Celtic tradition, it has a specific texture that reflects the landscape of Britain. The return of the sacred age is not described as a future event that will happen somewhere else. It is described as something that will happen here, in this landscape, in these hills and springs and stone circles. The land remembers. The land holds what has been placed in it, and when the time is right, what the land holds will rise again. This is why the Druids went underground with their deepest knowledge, rather than simply abandoning it or allowing it to be lost in the disruptions of the Roman conquest. They believed it needed to be preserved, carried forward, kept alive, until the time when it could once again be received and used. They were acting as a bridge between two periods of sacred intensity, the Neolithic past and the future, that they could not see, but that they believed was coming. And this gives us a different way to understand the suppression of Druidic practice by the Romans. The Romans were not simply eliminating a religious tradition that was inconvenient for colonial administration, although it certainly was that. They were, whether they knew it or not, interrupting a tradition of knowledge transmission that had been ongoing for thousands of years. They were cutting a thread. The Roman general Suetonius Paulinus led the assault on the Druidic stronghold on the island of Anglesey in 61 CE, the same year as Boudicca's revolt. The classical historian Tacitus describes the scene in terms that make clear how seriously the Romans took the destruction of the Druidic tradition. They were not treating it as the elimination of a local religious custom. They were treating it as a strategic objective, as something that genuinely threatened Roman control of Britain in a fundamental way. The groves were cut down, the altars were destroyed, Druidic practice was banned throughout the Roman Empire. But knowledge does not die as easily as groves burn. The oral tradition that the Druids had maintained with such care did not simply vanish when the Druids lost their institutional power. It went underground again, deeper this time, into forms that were less recognizable as the sophisticated philosophical tradition it actually was. It went into folk practice, into local custom, into the maintenance of specific sacred sites as places of healing or of marking that survived the Roman period, survived the Christian conversion, survived the Norman conquest, and in attenuated and transformed forms, survived all the way to the present. The holy wells of Britain, the Clutie wells of Scotland, the healing springs marked with rags and pins and coins and small offerings that you can still find in corners of the British countryside, these are the last visible traces of a tradition that began when the very first people in this landscape recognized that certain places in the ground held something worth approaching with care and attention. The tradition has changed beyond recognition in its surface form, but the underlying recognition that the land is not a background but a participant, that specific places in that land have a quality that rewards attention and honors respect, that recognition is still here. 10,000 years old and still here. The Druids did not create it. They inherited it, shaped it, articulated it in philosophical terms, and did their best to preserve it against the disruptions of history. And before the Druids, the Bronze Age people, they inherited it from, did the same. And before them, the Neolithic builders. And before them, the Mesolithic hunters in their antler headdresses at the edge of a Yorkshire lake. And before them, the very first people in Britain, whose names we will never know and whose language vanished without any trace, but who recognized this landscape and responded to it with the full depth of their human awareness. That is a 10,000-year conversation, and it is still going on. You can join it tonight if you want to. You can find a spring, or a hilltop, or a grove, or a stone circle, or you can simply find a quiet corner of British countryside, and you can sit with it and be quiet and see what you notice. Not what you expect, not what you have been told to expect, not the categories that heritage tourism and popular archaeology and folklore have provided. Just what you notice in your body and in your perception, in the quiet that settles when you stop moving and stop talking and start paying. The kind of attention that requires you to get out of your own way. That quality of attention is what the antler headdress people were cultivating at Starkar. It is what the long barrow builders were engineering with their resonant chambers and their astronomical orientations. It is what the henge builders were encoding in their enormous earthworks. It is what the Druids were training for in their 20 years of memorization and initiation. And it is perhaps what is being asked for again in this particular moment in history, when the distance from the sacred has reached dimensions that even the Druids could not have imagined. But let us not end there. Let us go further back still, because the story does not begin with the Mesolithic. It does not begin with Starkar and the antler headdresses. Human beings have been in Britain for much longer than 9,000 years, even though the ice sheets mean that the presence is intermittent and the evidence is sparse. And the places that were sacred in the Mesolithic were not randomly chosen. They were chosen, at least in part, in response to qualities of the landscape that existed long before any human being arrived to notice them. The landscape of Britain is old in a way that is almost impossible to hold in the mind. The chalk of the Wiltshire Downs was laid down as a seabed deposit roughly 70 million years ago. During the Cretaceous period, the granite of Dartmoor was intruded as magma roughly 300 million years ago. The limestone of the Cotswolds is older still. These rocks have been shaped by successive ice ages, by millions of years of water and wind erosion, by the slow and irresistible pressure of geological time operating on a scale that dwarfs human history in the same way that human history dwarfs a single human life. The springs that emerge from the chalk and limestone carry water that fell as rain, in some cases thousands of years ago, sinking slowly through the porous rock, traveling underground in ways that are only beginning to be mapped, emerging in specific locations determined by the detailed geology of the subsurface, in ways that have been consistent, with minor variations, for thousands of years. The same spring that Celtic offerings were placed in the Iron Age was probably flowing in the same location in the Neolithic. The same spring that Neolithic offerings were placed in was probably flowing in the same location in the Mesolithic. The water is older than any human tradition. The place is older than any human memory, and the relationship between human beings and these ancient places is itself a kind of geological phenomenon. It has been deposited in layers over millennia, each layer distinct but continuous with what lies below it, each layer an accumulation of the layers beneath it, the whole thing incomprehensibly deep. The Druids felt the depth of it. That was what kept them humble in their most authentic moments. Not humble in a self-deprecating or diminished way, but humble in the way that you are humble when you stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon or at the base of a mountain range, humble in response to something that is genuinely larger than you and that you recognize as genuinely larger, without that recognition diminishing you in any way. The knowledge that was hidden underground, the knowledge that scared them, was the knowledge of that depth. Not scary in the sense of malign or threatening, scary in the sense of being so much more than you expected, so much larger than your categories, so much older than your tradition, that your ordinary frameworks for making sense of experience simply cannot hold it. This is the most honest account I can give of what was in Britain before the Druids. Not a single entity, or a single tradition, or a single practice, but a quality of the landscape that has been drawing human attention and demanding human response for as long as human beings have been present in these islands. A quality that successive traditions have responded to in their own terms, with their own symbols and their own stories and their own practices, none of them adequate to what they were responding to, all of them valuable as responses. The Druids understood themselves as the most recent keepers of that relationship. They knew they had inherited more than they had created. They knew that what they held was not theirs to own, but theirs to steward. And they went underground with the deepest of it, not because they were afraid of it, but because they respected it too much to expose it carelessly. That is the tradition. That is the lineage. That is the underground river that flows beneath 10,000 years of British history. And if you want to find it, you do not need an academic library or a museum catalogue or a heritage trail leaflet. You need a hillside and some quiet and the willingness to pay attention. The landscape has not forgotten. The springs still flow, the stones are still standing, most of them. The hills still catch the light in the same extraordinary way they always have. And whatever was recognized in this landscape by the first people who walked through it is still here to be recognized. It has not gone anywhere. It simply went underground. Now let us talk about the specific mechanisms by which knowledge goes underground in a culture under threat, because this is not unique to Britain and not unique to the Druids. It is a pattern that appears wherever a sophisticated sacred tradition encounters a dominant force that does not understand or does not want to understand what it is confronting. The Romans were very good at assimilation. When they encountered a religious tradition in the cultures they conquered that was compatible with their own polytheistic framework, they assimilated it. They gave the local gods Roman names or matched them to Roman equivalents. They built Roman temples over Celtic sacred sites. They retained the sacred character of healing springs and oracular places and simply rebranded them in Roman terms. This process is called Interpretatio Romana, the Roman interpretation, and it was a remarkably effective tool of cultural colonization, precisely because it appeared tolerant and respectful while actually displacing and reframing. But there are limits to assimilation. When a tradition is sophisticated enough that it cannot be assimilated without being fundamentally distorted, when the thing you are trying to assimilate is complex enough that any simplification destroys what was valuable about it, then assimilation fails. And the Romans' assimilation of Celtic sacred practice failed at exactly this point. They could assimilate the healing springs, they could assimilate the warrior gods and the mother goddesses. They could assimilate the local topographical deities, the powers of rivers and hills and groves. What they could not assimilate was the underlying cosmological framework that connected all of these specific elements into a coherent whole. The Druids held that framework. They were the people who understood how the specific sacred sites related to each other, how the local deities related to the broader cosmological structure, how the seasonal rituals connected to the long cycles of time that the Druidic teaching described. Without the Druids, the specific elements of Celtic sacred life continued. The wells kept receiving offerings, the hilltops kept hosting fires, the sacred trees kept being marked and respected. But the understanding of why, the ability to see the whole system of which these practices were parts, that was disrupted. The Romans knew this. Their targeting of the Druids specifically rather than Celtic religious practice in general was not accidental. They understood, at some level, that the Druids were the framework holders, the people without whom the tradition could not sustain its full complexity. Destroy the Druids, and you do not destroy Celtic religion, but you fragment it. You reduce it to a collection of local customs without the larger context that gave them their full meaning. You make it manageable. This is exactly what happened, and it is exactly the kind of thing that the tradition, in its underground form, was designed to survive, because the knowledge had not been kept only in the Druids. The Druids were the most formal and articulate expression of a tradition that was also held in less formal and less articulate ways throughout the Celtic communities of Britain and Gaul. Held in stories, held in the local knowledge of healers and midwives, held in the maintenance of specific sacred places that everyone in a community understood to be important, even if they could not have articulated why in philosophical terms. Held in the songs that people sang at specific times of year, held in the games that children played on certain days, games that were old when their grandparents were children, and that encoded in their rules and their gestures and their seasonal timing fragments of a cosmological understanding that had been underground for so long that no one any longer knew it was there. This is what survival looks like in an underground tradition. Not the preservation of a pristine and complete philosophical system, not the maintenance of an institution, but the persistence of fragments, of practices without fully remembered rationale, of places that continue to receive attention and respect long after the specific understanding of why they deserve that attention and respect has been lost or transformed beyond recognition. The holy wells of Britain are perhaps the most visible example of this persistence. There are thousands of them. Many of them are marked on ordnance survey maps. Many of them have medieval Christian dedications, named for local saints associated with specific healing powers. But the medieval Christian dedication is almost never the origin of the well's sacred status. The wells were sacred before the saints. The saints were layered on top of an existing tradition of sacred water that goes back, in many cases, to the Bronze Age or further. The Christian church in Britain was remarkably pragmatic about this. Rather than trying to suppress the tradition of sacred wells, it absorbed it. It gave the wells Christian names and Christian stories and Christian ritual contexts, and in doing so, it preserved, in attenuated and transformed form, the basic recognition that these specific places in the landscape had a quality that rewarded engagement. The church also preserved the practice of the cluti, the offering left at the well, usually a rag or piece of clothing tied to a nearby tree, sometimes accompanied by a coin thrown into the water or a small object left on a stone. The meaning of this practice in the Christian period was prayer, asking the saint for healing or assistance. But the practice itself, the physical act of leaving something of yourself at a specific watery place, is demonstrably older than Christianity in Britain. It connects directly to the Iron Age practice of votive deposition, of placing offerings in watery places as a way of entering into relationship with whatever power inhabits them. And underneath the Iron Age practice is the Neolithic practice, and underneath the Neolithic practice is the Mesolithic practice, and underneath the Mesolithic practice is the simple recognition by the first human beings in this landscape that some places in the ground are different from others, and that difference deserves acknowledgement. The line from the Mesolithic to the medieval Cluti well is not a line that anyone drew consciously or maintained deliberately. It is a line that the landscape drew through the consistent quality of specific places over thousands of years. The places kept drawing people. The people kept responding. The responses changed in form and rationale, but continued in structure. And the structure, the act of bringing something of yourself to a specific place and leaving it as an acknowledgement of what that place holds, that survived everything. Let us now turn to something that the academic literature treats with considerable caution, but that deserves direct engagement. The question of what, precisely, was being acknowledged. What is the quality that these places hold? What were the Neolithic builders responding to? What were the Druids trying to preserve and transmit? What is the underground river that has been flowing through British sacred tradition for 10,000 years? There are several answers to this question, each of them partial, each of them drawn from a different discipline or perspective. The geophysical answer involves measurable anomalies. Many of the sites identified as sacred in British prehistory, many of the springs and stone circles and hilltop locations that received the most intensive ceremonial attention over the longest period of time, display measurable geophysical anomalies, unusual magnetic fields, unusual patterns of electrical conductivity in the local geology, unusual acoustic properties, in some cases, unusual concentrations of natural radioactivity from uranium-bearing minerals in the bedrock. Dragon Project, a systematic investigation conducted in Britain in the late 20th century, measured geophysical properties at a large number of megalithic sites and found consistent anomalies that distinguished these sites from the surrounding landscape. The anomalies were not large enough to be dangerous. They were not the kind of thing that would register as obviously significant to an ordinary person passing through, but they were consistent. And the question of whether human beings, after thousands of generations of evolution in close relationship with the natural landscape, might be sensitive to these kinds of low-level geophysical variations in ways that our conscious mind does not register, is a question that has not been fully answered by mainstream science. The neurological answer involves the capacity of specific environments to alter states of consciousness. The resonant acoustics of megalithic chambers, combined with other factors such as the darkness, the physical enclosure, the potentially altered oxygen levels, and the psychological context of ritual preparation, create conditions that human neurophysiology responds to in specific and consistent ways. The brain, placed in these conditions, shifts its activity patterns. Perception changes. The ordinary distinction between self and environment becomes less sharp. Attention deepens. Memory and sensation and emotion become more vivid and more connected to each other. These are not effects that require supernatural explanation. They are effects that follow from what we know about how human nervous systems respond to specific environmental stimuli. The prehistoric people who built these chambers knew from direct experience what happened to human perception inside them. They designed the chambers to enhance those effects, and they understood the experiences that resulted not as hallucination or delusion, but as a form of perception, a way of receiving information about the nature of the world that was not available in ordinary waking consciousness. The ecological answer involves the fact that the places identified as sacred in British prehistory are very frequently places that are also ecologically significant. Springs, obviously, but also ridgetops and valley heads and the junctions of watercourses and the edges of different ecological zones. These are places where the landscape is most active, where geological processes are most directly visible, where biological diversity is highest, where the non-human world is most concentrated and most complex. Spending time in these places, paying close attention to them over multiple seasons and multiple years, produces a quality of knowledge about how the natural world works that is not available from any other kind of engagement. The sacred sites of British prehistory are an atlas of ecological knowledge. They are the places where the landscape has the most to teach anyone who is paying attention. And the tradition of returning to these places, of marking them and honoring them and engaging with them through ritual, was also a tradition of sustained ecological attention, of knowing the landscape not in the way a surveyor knows it, as a set of measurable features, but in the way a long-term inhabitant knows it, as a living community of which you are a part and to which you have responsibilities. These three answers, the geophysical, the neurological, and the ecological, are not mutually exclusive. They are probably all partially correct, and they probably all contribute to the quality that the tradition has been responding to for 10,000 years. But none of them, individually or together, fully explains the thing. They describe mechanisms, they describe channels through which something flows, but they do not describe the something itself. The tradition had its own language for the something. In the Celtic languages, there are words and phrases that try to capture it. In Irish, the concept of imbas forosnai again, the illuminating wisdom. In Welsh, the concept of awen, which is usually translated as flowing inspiration, but which, in its original usage, seems to refer to a specific mode of consciousness, a specific quality of perception in which ordinary and non-ordinary reality are simultaneously available. These are not vague poetic terms. They are technical terms that describe specific experiential states that specific practices were designed to induce. The tradition that predates the Druids did not have these linguistic terms because those terms belong to a Celtic linguistic tradition that arrived in Britain relatively late, sometime in the first millennium BCE. But the experiences the terms describe are older than the words for them. The experiences were being had in the megalithic chambers of the Neolithic. They were being had in the antler headdress rituals of the Mesolithic. They were being had wherever a specific kind of attention, in a specific kind of place, in a specific kind of practice, created the conditions for a quality of perception that was different from ordinary waking consciousness, and that was recognized as revealing something about the nature of reality that ordinary waking consciousness did not have access to. That is what was underground. That is what the Druids were trying to preserve. Not a theology, not a set of ritual prescriptions, not a body of historical fact. An experiential state, a mode of consciousness that could only be transmitted through direct experience, that could not be adequately described or conveyed through any form of written or spoken language, and that required specific conditions, specific places, specific preparation, specific guidance to be reliably induced. The 20-year training period of the Druids was not primarily about memorizing large amounts of information, although that was part of it. It was primarily about learning the conditions under which that experiential state could be reliably reached, maintained long enough to be useful, and integrated back into ordinary life in a way that was productive rather than simply destabilizing. This is why the knowledge went underground rather than simply disappearing. You cannot write it down, but you also cannot make it entirely inaccessible, because it is ultimately an experience that human beings are capable of. Given the right conditions and the right guidance, any human being can have the experience that the tradition was transmitting. The tradition does not make the experience possible. The experience is already possible. The tradition makes it more likely, more reliable, more able to be used productively when it occurs. Going underground meant finding ways to preserve the conditions, even when the explicit transmission of the knowledge was no longer possible. Preserving specific places, preserving specific practices, preserving specific times of year, preserving the social structures that would allow groups of people to gather in the right places at the right times and pay the right kind of attention. Even when the philosophical framework that made sense of all of this was no longer available, the conditions could still be maintained. And if the conditions were maintained long enough, there was always the possibility that someone in a future generation would have the experience and would be in a position to understand what they had experienced and would find ways to articulate it and transmit it to others. This is, in a sense, what happened in Britain between the suppression of the Druids and the present day. The conditions were partially preserved through the holy wells and the seasonal celebrations and the local customs and the persistent acknowledgement of specific sacred sites. The experience occurred periodically in individuals who were in the right place with the right quality of attention. And the articulation and transmission have been happening, haltingly and imperfectly, for the last several centuries as the tradition has begun to surface again. You do not need to believe any particular cosmology to engage with this honestly. You do not need to accept the existence of supernatural entities or miraculous powers or a personal god of any description. What you need is the recognition that human consciousness is richer and more varied than its ordinary daytime mode, and that the natural landscape in certain specific locations and certain specific conditions has the capacity to elicit modes of human consciousness that are different from and in some ways more informative than the ordinary mode. And the recognition that a tradition that has been working with this reality for 10,000 years probably has something to teach us about what those conditions are and how to work with what they make available. That is the core of what went underground. That is the core of what the tradition preserved. That is the core of what is still here, in the hills and the springs and the stones of Britain, waiting for the kind of attention that knows how to receive it. Let us come back to Stonehenge now, because we have been circling around it, and it is time to look at it directly. Stonehenge is not the oldest monument in Britain. It is not the largest. It is not, in the view of most serious researchers, the most significant. But it is the most famous, and it is famous for a reason. Something about Stonehenge, something that has persisted through every period of its history, including periods when its meaning was completely lost and it was used as a convenient quarry for building material, has kept drawing people back to it, has kept making it the center of something. The current structure at Stonehenge is the result of at least 5 major phases of construction spread over roughly 1,000 years, from about 3000 BCE to about 2000 BCE. The earliest phase was not the dramatic ring of standing stones that most people picture. The earliest phase was a circular earthwork, a bank and ditch, much like other henges, with a series of pits around its interior edge. These pits, known as the Aubrey Holes, originally held standing posts, probably of timber, arranged in a circle. The monument at this stage would have been impressive, primarily as an earthwork, as a cleared and defined sacred space in the landscape, not as a stone monument. The sarsen stones, the massive grey blocks that give Stonehenge its characteristic appearance, were not raised until roughly 2500 BCE, 500 years after the earliest earthwork. And before the sarsen stones were erected, there were the blue stones. The blue stones are smaller stones, currently 62 of them remaining, composed of various rock types, including spotted dolerite and rhyolite, that are found naturally only in the Prehistoric Hills of West Wales, approximately 240 miles from Stonehenge. They were brought to the site sometime around 2500 to 2400 BCE, and the method of their transport overland, and perhaps partially by sea, across a distance of nearly 250 miles, required a commitment of social energy and organizational capacity that is genuinely astonishing for a society without metal tools or wheeled transport. Why were the bluestones brought specifically from Wales? This is a question that has received a great deal of attention in recent years, and the most current research suggests that the answer is intimately connected to the tradition we have been tracing. The Preseli Hills were themselves a sacred landscape in the Neolithic period. There are monument complexes in the Preseli area, in the county of Pembrokeshire, that predate the Sarsen phase of Stonehenge and that appear to have been part of the same broad tradition of sacred landscape construction. The bluestones were not taken from just anywhere in Wales. They were taken from specific locations in the Preseli Hills that appear to have been sacred in their own right, that had their own significance within the local sacred geography. The bringing of stones from one sacred landscape to another was not a practical act of construction. It was a cosmological act, a way of connecting two sacred landscapes, of creating a relationship between the powers of the Preseli Hills and the powers of the Wiltshire Plain, of bringing the specific quality of one place into relationship with the specific quality of another. And the quality of the Preseli Hills is specific and remarkable. The spotted dolerite of Carn Menyn, the specific outcrop from which many of the Stonehenge bluestones appear to have come, is a rock with an unusual acoustic property. When struck, it rings. Not like a bell, but with a low resonant vibration that carries further and lasts longer than you would expect from a rock of its size. The Welsh name for these rocks is the Ringing Rocks, and they have been known and remarked upon for as long as people have lived in their vicinity. Imagine what it meant to the people who first encountered these rocks. They strike a stone, and it rings. They strike another stone, and it rings differently. They set several of them together, and they produce a kind of music, a deep, unusual music that does not sound like anything else in the natural world. And they understand, within their framework of sacred geography, that the quality of a place is expressed in its specific character, in the way it looks and sounds and feels, in the specific properties of the materials it contains. These ringing rocks are not just rocks. They are expressions of a specific quality of the Preseli landscape, a quality that resonates, and the decision to take these resonant rocks, these expression of the Preseli landscape's specific quality, and carry them 240 miles to place them in a monument at the centre of the sacred landscape of Wiltshire. That decision was not impractical or irrational. Within the framework of the tradition we have been tracing, it was deeply logical. It was the creation of a resonance between two of the most powerful landscapes in Britain, a drawing together of different qualities into a single monument that would be, in some sense, the sum of both. This is the sophistication that was underground, not in the sense of being hidden deliberately, but in the sense of operating at a level of cosmological understanding that is not visible from the surface of the archaeological record unless you know what you are looking for. The people who carried the bluestones from Preseli were not simply building a monument. They were conducting a cosmological experiment. They were testing a hypothesis about how sacred places interact with each other and what becomes possible when their qualities are brought into direct contact. The sarsen stones that were added later, raised in the characteristic horseshoe and outer ring of Stonehenge's most famous phase, came from the Marlborough Downs, only 20 miles to the north. But the sarsen stones are themselves unusual. They are the hardest naturally occurring rock in Britain, resistant to weathering in a way that explains why Stonehenge's lintels are still in place 5,000 years after they were raised. But they were also shaped. Unlike the rough natural stones of Avebury, the sarsens of Stonehenge were carefully dressed, their surfaces smoothed, their edges squared, their dimensions standardized. This required enormous effort with nothing but stone tools. The shaping of the sarsen uprights and lintels represents hundreds of thousands of hours of skilled stoneworking, and the mortise and tenon joints that connect the uprights to the lintels, joints that would be entirely at home in a timber structure, but that are unusual in stonework, suggest that the people who built Stonehenge were working from a tradition of timber construction that they were translating into stone for reasons of permanence. They wanted it to last. They wanted it to still be there when people who had not yet been born came to find it. They were not building for themselves or for their community or for their generation. They were building for the future, for the continuation of the tradition that had led them to this specific place and this specific act of construction. And in this, they succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. Stonehenge is still there, transformed, partially ruined, heavily visited, reduced in many ways from what it was, but still there. The stones are still standing. The astronomical alignments are still working. On the morning of the summer solstice, the rising sun still enters the monument along the avenue and illuminates the interior in the way that was designed into the monument 5,000 years ago. The thing that was built to be permanent has proved permanent. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough for the tradition to continue to use it. Enough for every generation since the builders to have the option of coming to this place and engaging with what is here. Enough for the underground river to have a place where it can surface and be recognized. The Druids who came to Stonehenge did not build it. They inherited it as they inherited the whole landscape of which it was a part. They used it as one element in a broader sacred geography that they understood to be a living system, a system in which each monument related to the others and to the natural landscape in ways that created possibilities for practice and understanding that could not be realized by any single element in isolation. And when Roman suppression forced the Druidic tradition underground, Stonehenge went with it. The formal ritual use of the monument ceased. The philosophical framework that explained its construction and governed its use was lost, at least in its explicit form, but the monument endured, and the recognition that it was somehow important, somehow deserving of acknowledgement and respect and wonder, that never entirely disappeared. Medieval writers recorded it with bafflement. The name Stonehenge appears in English documents from the 12th century onward, but the knowledge of who built it and why had been completely lost, to be replaced by legends attributing it to Merlin or to giants or to Druids themselves, who were in fact relative newcomers to the site that now bore their name in popular imagination. The connection between the Druids and Stonehenge is one of the most persistent and most misleading stories in British archaeology. The Druids who practiced at Stonehenge, if indeed they did practice there, were arriving thousands of years after the monument was built, inheriting and using something they had not created, bringing to it a tradition of sacred practice that was itself an inheritance from even older traditions. But in popular history, the Druids built Stonehenge, and that story has been remarkably resistant to the archaeological evidence that definitively disproves it. Why? Because it is a story that makes a certain kind of sense. It places the most famous monument with the most famous priestly class. It creates a tidy narrative. It gives the famous thing a famous creator. And tidy narratives have enormous persistence in human culture, even when they are wrong, precisely because they are tidy. They satisfy a need for comprehension that the more complicated truth does not satisfy in the same way. The more complicated truth is more interesting. It involves a tradition that is so old that the Druids themselves regarded it with something approaching awe, a tradition that created the monuments and then vanished, leaving the monuments to be inherited and used and partially understood by people who had not created them. A tradition that the Druids spent 20 years learning to comprehend and never fully comprehended, and were honest enough about this to admit it to the few classical writers who asked the right questions. What they could tell the classical writers about their training was the surface of what they knew. The deeper things, the things that had come from the people before them and that they were passing on to the people after them, those could not be told. Not because they were secret in the sense of being withheld from the curious, but because they were the kind of knowledge that cannot be put into words without losing something essential. The knowledge of what it feels like to be in a specific place, at a specific time, in a specific state of mind, and to have that combination of factors produce an experience that reveals something about the nature of reality. That is not communicable in language. It can only be given through the conditions themselves. And the conditions are available in the landscape, in the springs and the stones and the hills and the sky, to anyone who knows how to engage with them. This is the final mystery of the underground tradition. It is not secret in the way that secrets are usually understood, as information that is deliberately withheld. It is private in the way that any direct experience is private, as something that must be had personally to be fully known. You can tell someone what a strawberry tastes like until you have described it in every detail you can think of, but they will not know the taste of a strawberry until they have eaten one. The tradition of the sacred landscape is the tradition of how to get to the strawberry. And the strawberry is still there. It grew in the Mesolithic. It grows now. The landscape has not changed in any way that matters. The springs are still flowing. The stones are still standing. The hills are still where they were. The quality that drew the first people to these specific places, the quality that 10,000 years of sacred tradition has been responding to, that quality is still here. It has not been depleted by use. It has not been diminished by the centuries of disconnection and suppression and forgetting. It was here before any of us arrived, and it will be here after all of us are gone. What changes is the human capacity to engage with it. What changes is the availability of the tradition that teaches engagement. What changes is the presence or absence of people who know the conditions that allow the experience. The Druids went underground to preserve the map of the conditions, not the experience, which they could not preserve directly, but the pointers to the experience, the knowledge of which places, which times, which practices, which states of preparation and approach are most likely to produce the experiential state in which something beyond ordinary consciousness becomes available. That map, the hidden geography of the sacred landscape of Britain, is what the underground tradition has been carrying for 2,000 years since the Roman suppression, carrying in fragments, carrying in transformed and partial forms, carrying in ways that are often no longer recognizable as what they are, but carrying nonetheless. And the landscape, patient and ancient and absolutely indifferent to whether or not the human beings passing through it are paying the right kind of attention, keeps presenting itself, keeps offering the specific quality of light and sound and water and stone that it has been offering for millions of years, keeps waiting for the kind of attention that knows what to do with what it finds. The story of what was in Britain before the Druids is not a finished story. It is not a history that can be told in the past tense and then filed away. It is an ongoing reality that was active before the Druids arrived, that continued through the Druidic period, that went underground with the Druidic tradition when the Romans came, and that is still underground in the sense that it is still not fully surfaced, still not fully visible, still not fully named and comprehended and integrated into the way we understand our relationship to this landscape. But it is surfacing, slowly, imperfectly, with all the distortions and misunderstandings that attend any emerging thing. But surfacing, the academic study of sacred landscapes, the growing recognition in archaeological circles that the sacred sites of prehistoric Britain were products of a cosmological understanding more sophisticated than the traditional models allowed for, the renewed interest in the phenomenology of place and the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world, all of these are signs of a surfacing, and the practical engagement with the landscape itself, The millions of people who walk the hills and visit the springs and stand in the stone circles every year, not with any particular agenda or belief system, but simply because something draws them there, something they cannot fully name, but cannot entirely ignore. That is also a sign of a surfacing. The tradition is finding its way back to the surface, through the cracks in the pavement of modernity, through the gaps in the noise of contemporary life, through the moments when people get quiet enough to notice that the landscape is not silent. It was never silent. It has been speaking for 10,000 years. We stopped listening for a while, but the speaking did not stop. Before the Druids, there was something so ancient and so deep in this landscape that even the most learned and the most spiritually sophisticated people in the ancient Western world, the people who spent 20 years learning to engage with it, approached it with awe and care and the recognition that they were in the presence of something larger than themselves. That something is still here, and it is worth knowing. There is a particular experience that people report at ancient sacred sites across Britain. It does not always happen. It cannot be reliably induced by simply standing in the right place and waiting. But it happens often enough to enough different people in enough different circumstances that it has to be taken seriously as a data point rather than simply dismissed as wishful thinking or susceptibility to suggestion. The experience is of presence, not the presence of a particular entity or a particular person. Simply presence. The sense that the place you are in is not empty in the way that an unoccupied room is empty, but full in a way that the absence of visible occupants does not diminish. The sense that something is attending, something is aware, something is in relationship with you, in a way that does not depend on your asking for it, or looking for it, or expecting it. People who have this experience in sacred landscapes are not, as a group, particularly credulous or spiritually naive. The reports come from scientists and engineers, and business people, and skeptics of every kind, as well as from people with established spiritual practices and religious commitments. The experience seems to be genuinely democratic in its distribution, not correlated with prior belief or expectation, not more common among people who believe in such things than among people who don't. This suggests that the experience is a response to something real, something that is actually present in these places, something that human nervous systems register, regardless of what the conscious mind believes about what should or should not be there. The tradition that preceded the Druids, and that the Druids inherited and preserved, was built on the foundation of this experience. It was not built on belief in the experience, on the theoretical proposition that such a thing might be possible. It was built on the direct evidence of the experience itself, accumulated over thousands of years of engagement with specific places in the landscape of Britain. The people who built the long barrows and the henges and the stone circles were responding to something they had directly experienced, something they could not explain in the terms available to them, but that they could respond to, creatively and collectively and with extraordinary commitment. And the response, the 10,000-year-long collective creative and ceremonial response, is what we call prehistoric Britain, not a period of simple survival before civilization arrived, a period of deep and sustained engagement with something in the landscape that demanded and received that engagement, a period whose monuments are still standing, whose sacred sites are still drawing people, whose underground tradition is still flowing. The Druids were part of that response, a particularly articulate and self-aware part, a part that could formulate in philosophical terms what its predecessors had expressed in stone and earth, but still only a part. The full story begins before them and continues after them and has not ended yet. And this is what makes the history of sacred Britain so much more interesting than the history we usually get. Not a series of discrete periods, each one beginning where the previous one left off. Not a progression from primitive to sophisticated, from ignorant to knowledgeable. but a continuous engagement, evolving in form and articulation, but constant in its fundamental direction, with something in the landscape that has been here far longer than any human tradition, and that will be here long after the last human tradition has run its course. The land remembers. That is the oldest teaching of the oldest tradition in Britain. The land holds what has been given to it. The springs keep the offerings. The chalk keeps the marks. The stones keep the alignments. And the quality that drew the first people to these places keeps drawing people still, across the 10,000-year gap, across every cultural disruption and historical discontinuity, across the enormous distance between the world of the antler headdress people and the world of someone lying in bed on a quiet night, listening to this. That quality is not diminished. The landscape is not diminished. What was here before the Druids, the thing that scared them with its depth and its age and its inexhaustible presence, is still here. If you want to find it, go to the hills, go to the springs, go to the stone circles if you can, go slowly, go quietly, go without expectations, without a framework already in place that tells you what to find. Go with the simple willingness to pay attention, and then pay attention. The land has been waiting 10,000 years for people who can do this. It is not impatient. It is not demanding. It is simply there, as it has always been, full of a quality that rewards exactly this kind of simple, sustained, open-ended human attention. That is the tradition. That is the underground river. That is what was in Britain before the Druids, what scared them underground with its depth and its age, and what is still here now, still flowing, still offering itself to anyone who knows how to be quiet enough to receive what it has to give. Rest with it tonight. Let the hills be present in your imagination. Let the springs flow in your mind. Let the stones stand in their circles on their chalk hills under whatever sky is above you. And let whatever it is that has been drawing human attention to this landscape for 10,000 years, the thing the Druids knew and protected and went underground to preserve, let that touch the edge of your awareness as you drift towards sleep. It has been here a very long time. It knows how to wait, and it knows how to meet you when you are quiet enough. Good night. I appreciate you listening. If you enjoyed the story, drop your thoughts in the comments. I would love to read them. There is something that needs to be said about time before we go any further. Not the kind of time that appears on clocks or calendars. Not the kind that we measure in years and decades and centuries. The kind of time that the landscape itself embodies. The kind of time that makes a chalk hill feel different from a shopping mall, even if you are only half paying attention, even if you have not been told that the chalk hill is old. There is a quality to deep time that registers in the body before it registers in the mind, and that quality is one of the things you are touching when you engage with the ancient sacred sites of Britain. The Druids had a word for it, or rather, they had a concept that their various languages approximated in different ways. The great time, the time behind time, the time that surrounds and contains the ordinary time of human life, the way an ocean surrounds and contains a boat. You can be in the ocean without knowing it. You can be on the surface of it and feel only the immediate motion of waves and wind and never attend to the vast depth beneath you. But the depth is there, and in certain moments, in certain conditions of stillness and attention, you become aware of it, not as an abstraction, as a physical fact, as something pressing against the hull of your ordinary awareness and asking to be acknowledged. The sacred sites of Britain are places where that depth is close to the surface, where the thickness of the membrane between ordinary time and the great time is at its thinnest, not because of anything magical in the sense of supernatural, but because these places have accumulated so much of ordinary time that the weight of it does something to the quality of the space. Millions of individual moments of human presence and attention, layered over 10,000 years. millions of individual interactions between human consciousness and the specific qualities of these specific places, millions of prayers and offerings and songs and stories and tears and silences. All of that remains, not as information, not as a record that can be read, but as a quality, a weight, a depth that the place has acquired through the accumulated presence of all those people and all those moments. This is not metaphysics. This is phenomenology, the direct description of what human consciousness experiences in specific environments, and the phenomenological description of what people experience in the ancient sacred sites of Britain is remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries and individual backgrounds. The word that comes up most often in accounts from the most varied sources is weight. These places feel heavy, heavy with time, heavy with accumulated presence, heavy in a way that is not threatening but that is significant, that demands a certain quality of attention and a certain quietness of ego. The Druids understood this phenomenological reality and built their teaching around it. The 20-year training was not primarily about loading the initiate with information. It was primarily about training the initiate's nervous system and attentional capacity to engage with these heavy places without being overwhelmed, without being reduced to a passive recipient of whatever the place offered, but also without projecting onto the place the initiate's own expectations and categories and preferred meanings. The training was about calibration, about becoming a refined instrument for the reception of something that was available in the landscape, but that required a very specific quality of attention to receive without distortion. This is an extraordinarily sophisticated pedagogical goal. It requires the teacher to have achieved that calibration themselves before they can teach it. It requires the student to have the natural aptitude for it and the willingness to spend years developing it. And it requires the community to support the teacher-student relationship across the long time it takes for the calibration to be achieved. The Druidic community was organized to provide exactly this support. The classical sources describe a society in which the Druids were exempt from taxation, from military service, from the practical obligations that consumed the time and energy of everyone else. Not as a privilege, but as a necessity. The work of becoming a calibrated instrument for the reception of what the sacred landscape offered was full-time work. It could not be done alongside farming or fighting or trading. It required the full attention of the practitioner across a span of years that was longer than most people in the ancient world spent doing anything. The social investment in maintaining this class of specialists was enormous, and it was made voluntarily, consistently, over a very long period of time, by a society that could have chosen to spend its surplus differently. The fact that it was made tells us something important about what the Druids were understood to provide. They were not primarily performing ceremonies that the community required for social cohesion, though they did that too. They were not primarily adjudicating disputes and maintaining social order, though they did that as well. They were primarily doing something that their community understood as essential, but that their community could not do for itself. They were maintaining the connection between the human community and something in the landscape that the human community needed. What the community needed from that connection is another of those questions that cannot be answered with complete confidence, but that the evidence points toward consistently. The communities that maintained the Druids were agricultural communities, dependent on the weather and the soil and the timing of the seasons in ways that a hunter-gatherer society was not. And the knowledge that the Druidic training gave access to, the deep knowledge of the landscape and of the great cycles of time and of the relationship between the cosmic and the local, was directly relevant to the practical needs of those communities. When to plant, when to harvest, when to expect the summer drought that would shrivel the grain if the fields were not prepared for it, when to expect the winter flooding that would damage the roots if the drainage was not managed correctly. This is not information that can be obtained from astronomical tables or from meteorological instruments. It is information that comes from long and intimate acquaintance with a specific landscape across many seasons, combined with an understanding of the larger cycles within which those seasons occur. The Druids had both: the intimate acquaintance, developed through years of daily presence in the sacred places of the landscape, and the understanding of the larger cycles transmitted through the oral tradition from people who had been developing that understanding for thousands of years. This practical utility of the Druidic knowledge is something that tends to get lost in the more mystical accounts of Druidic practice. The Druids were not simply contemplatives or philosophers or ritual specialists, as valuable as those functions were. They were also, in a very direct and practical sense, agricultural advisors. They knew the land in the way that only someone who has spent years paying close attention to a specific landscape can know it. And that knowledge was directly valuable to the community's survival. The underground tradition, the tradition that went below the surface of official practice, when Roman suppression made that surface unsafe, carried this practical knowledge as well as the more philosophical and experiential content. The folk traditions around planting times and harvest timing and the observation of weather signs that persisted throughout the medieval period and into the modern era in rural Britain are in many cases direct descendants of this practical agricultural knowledge, transformed, partially decontextualized, often stripped of the broader cosmological understanding that made sense of them, but retained because they worked, because the signs really did predict the weather, because the timing really did produce better crops, because the practical wisdom really was based on an accurate understanding of how the land behaved across cycles of time that no single generation could observe in full. Let us now turn to the specific content of the deeper mysteries, because it is time to be more specific about what was actually being preserved and what its significance was. The deepest content of the pre-Druidic sacred tradition of Britain appears, from the evidence available to us, to have been organized around three fundamental insights. Each of these insights is complex enough that many books have been written around each of them, and we can only sketch them here. But the sketches are enough to suggest why the tradition regarded them as worth 10,000 years of continuous effort to preserve. The first insight is about death, not about what happens after death, in the sense of the theological question that preoccupies most religious traditions, but about what death is in the first place. The pre-Druidic tradition, evidenced by the long barrows and the burial practices and the iconography of the megalithic monuments, appears to have understood death not as an ending, but as a transition of a very specific kind, a transition from one mode of participation in the world to another mode of participation. The dead, in this framework, did not go away. They went deeper. They moved into the aspect of the world that was less visible, less tangible, less available to the ordinary senses, but not less real and not less present. This is not a simple belief in an afterlife of the kind that later religious traditions describe. It is a more subtle understanding, in which the boundary between the living and the dead is not a wall, but a membrane, permeable in both directions under the right conditions. The dead continue to participate in the life of their community, their landscape, their world, not as ghosts in the popular sense, as pale, diminished remnants of their former selves, but as a deepened presence, a presence that is less localized, less individual, more merged with the landscape and the great time that the landscape embodies. The long barrow chambers, with their acoustics engineered to alter the perception of anyone inside them, and their astronomical alignments that allowed specific moments of solar and lunar light to penetrate into otherwise dark spaces, were not tombs in our sense. They were interfaces, places where the membrane between the world of the living and the world of the dead was deliberately thinned, where the deepened presence of the ancestors could be encountered, where the community could interact with those who had gone deeper. The selected bones that were placed in these chambers, often bones of multiple individuals mixed together, defleshed and cleaned and arranged without the articulated skeleton structure they had in life, were not simply remains in our sense. They were something more like antennae, physical connections to specific presences that had passed and through death into the deeper participation. And the community that interacted with these bones in the resonant darkness of the chamber was interacting not with dead matter, but with active presences. This understanding of death and its relationship to the sacred landscape is the oldest content of the British tradition. It precedes the Neolithic long barrows. It goes back to the very beginning of human presence in these islands, and it persisted in transformed and attenuated forms all the way through the Druidic period and beyond. The Celtic belief in the thinness of the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, most familiar to us now in the tradition of Samhain, the festival that has become Halloween, is a direct descendant of this very ancient insight. The second insight is about the structure of time, the pre-Druidic tradition, evidenced by the astronomical orientations of the megalithic monuments and the elaborate care with which they tracked solar and lunar cycles across decades and centuries, appears to have understood time not as a straight line, but as a complex of nested cycles, each cycle embedded in a larger cycle, each cycle creating conditions that recur in predictable patterns at predictable intervals. This is not simply the observation that days repeat and years repeat, which any attentive creature would notice. It is the understanding that there are much larger cycles, cycles too long for any individual life to observe directly, that create patterns of condition and possibility that span generations. The 19-year Metonic cycle, after which the phases of the moon return to the same relationship with the solar calendar, is one of these larger cycles. But the tradition appears to have been tracking cycles even longer than this, the cycles of the outer planets possibly, and the very long period cycles of stellar precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the night sky to appear to rotate over a period of roughly 26,000 years. The precision required to track cycles of this length, using nothing but careful naked eye observation across many generations, is extraordinary, but it is achievable. And the evidence that prehistoric observers in Britain were achieving it is present in the alignments of the monuments, which in many cases can only be explained if the builders were working with knowledge of stellar positions that differs significantly from the stellar positions visible today because of the long period stellar precession. This means that the builders of these monuments were not only tracking cycles much longer than any individual life, they were doing so with enough precision that the knowledge they were generating was genuinely useful, genuinely predictive, genuinely superior to what would be available from observation within a single lifetime. And the way you transmit knowledge that requires multiple human lifetimes to generate is through an oral tradition of exactly the kind that the Druidic training preserved. The understanding of large-scale temporal cycles was not merely an astronomical curiosity for the pre-Druidic tradition. It was connected to the deepest questions of cosmology, to the understanding of what the great time is, and how the ordinary time of human life sits within it. If time is cyclic in a very large way, if there are ages and epochs and great years, as well as seasons and solar years, then the meaning of any particular moment in time is partly a function of where that moment sits within the larger cycles, and the ability to know where you are in the larger cycles, to understand what kind of time you are living in and what that means for the possibilities available to you, is a form of wisdom that has direct practical and spiritual value. The Druidic teaching about the great time was the most directly accessible form of this ancient understanding. The Druids taught that the current age was one of increasing distance from the sacred, that the direct perception of the sacred that had been available in earlier times was no longer accessible in the same way, and that this was not a permanent condition, but a phase in a much larger cycle that would eventually bring conditions of greater access back. This teaching was both descriptive and consolatory. It explained why the present moment felt diminished compared to what the sacred sites and the oral tradition described, and it gave a framework within which that diminishment could be understood as temporary and ultimately purposeful, rather than as a permanent loss. The third insight is about the nature of consciousness itself. The pre-Druidic tradition, evidenced by the practices associated with the megalithic chambers, and by what we can infer from later Druidic and shamanic traditions that descend from it, appears to have understood human consciousness as fundamentally multiple, as capable of operating in multiple modes, and as connected to the natural world and to the landscape in ways that ordinary waking consciousness does not reveal. The mode of consciousness that the tradition was most interested in, the mode that the practices were designed to induce and that the sacred sites were designed to facilitate, was what we might call participatory consciousness, a mode in which the ordinary distinction between self and world is relaxed, in which the landscape and the sky and the water and the stone are not simply objects perceived by a separate subject, but participants in a shared reality that the conscious individual and the landscape are jointly inhabiting, a mode in which information about the state of the landscape and the larger world it participates in is directly available to the experiencing subject, not through any supernatural mechanism, but through the direct perceptual connection between a highly attuned human nervous system and the specific qualities of a specific place. This is the mode of consciousness that the long barrow chambers were engineered to facilitate, that the astronomical alignments were designed to induce by connecting the interior of the monument to the movements of celestial bodies at specific moments of astronomical significance, that the acoustic properties of the sites were shaped to enhance by altering the neurological state of anyone present inside them through the specific physical properties of sound at those frequencies. It is a mode of consciousness that is, in principle, available to any human being with the preparation and the conditions necessary to enter it. It is not a gift available only to the specially talented or the spiritually chosen. It is a capacity that the tradition believed to be universal in human beings, a capacity that had been more easily accessible in earlier periods of human history and that had become less accessible as the conditions of human life changed, but a capacity that, with the right preparation and the right conditions, could still be entered. The Druidic training was, above all, training in how to prepare for and enter this mode of consciousness reliably. The 20 years of memorization was not primarily about the information being memorized, as important as that information was. It was about the process of memorization itself, which involved extended periods of deep attention, of sitting with knowledge until it was not just mentally held but embodied, until it had become part of the practitioner's nervous system and perceptual apparatus, rather than simply part of their explicit memory. This kind of embodied knowing, this transformation of information into capacity, is itself a way of developing the attentional qualities needed to enter participatory consciousness reliably. These three insights, about death as transition rather than ending, about time as cyclic on multiple scales, and about consciousness as multiple and participatory rather than singular and separable, form the deep structure of what was underground in British sacred tradition. They are the content that the tradition was most careful to protect, because they were the content that was most easily distorted by simplification, most easily misunderstood by people who encountered them without adequate preparation, and most dangerously reduced by translation into the terms of cultural traditions that did not share the landscape and the practice from which they emerged. They went underground because they were too important to expose carelessly, and they were too important because they pointed toward truths about human existence, about death and time and consciousness, that have direct bearing on how you live and what you do with the life you have. Not truths in the sense of propositions that you can evaluate logically and either accept or reject. Truths in the sense of realities that you can encounter directly, in specific places, under specific conditions, with specific preparation, and that transform your understanding of your own life and your own possibilities in ways that no amount of logical argument can duplicate. The landscape of Britain is still offering these encounters. The places are still here. The springs are still flowing. The stones are still standing. And the tradition, in its underground form, in its transformed and partial and sometimes barely recognizable form, is still flowing too, finding its way toward the surface, finding the cracks and the gaps and the moments of quiet through which it can emerge. Tonight is one of those moments. This night, this voice, this story about what was here before the Druids and what went underground with them and what is still here now. This is the tradition in one of its current forms, partial, imperfect, missing the direct encounter with the sacred landscape that would make it complete, but pointing toward that encounter, pointing toward the hills and the springs and the stones and the quality of attention that meets them honestly and openly and without predetermined categories. If you are in Britain, you are sitting on top of 10,000 years of this tradition. It is under your feet right now. The underground river is flowing below you at whatever depth it has reached in the place where you are lying or sitting. And it is entirely possible that there are places near you, within walking distance or a short drive, where the ground becomes more permeable, where the river comes closer to the surface, where the quality of the landscape rewards the kind of attention that has been offered to it for thousands of years. If you can find one of those places and go to it slowly and quietly and without an agenda, without wanting it to be any particular way or produce any particular experience, you will be joining a very long tradition, a tradition that began in the Mesolithic and passed through the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, and the Roman period, and the medieval period, and every period since. Always adapting, always changing in surface form, always carrying forward the essential recognition that this landscape has something to offer that rewards attention. That is the most honest thing that can be said about what was here before the Druids. Not a belief system, not a set of practices that must be performed exactly as they were originally performed. Not a theology that must be accepted before the landscape will yield its knowledge, but a recognition, a simple, honest, direct recognition that the landscape is not background, that certain places in it are genuinely different, that attention to those places, given freely and without demand, opens something in the human being who gives it that does not open in any other way. The Druids knew this. They spent 20 years learning to give attention in exactly that way, and the people before them spent thousands of years building the conditions for it, carving the chambers and erecting the stones and aligning the monuments and tracking the cycles, all in service of creating the best possible circumstances for exactly that kind of attention to be given and to bear the knowledge it was capable of receiving. That work is still here. Those circumstances, in many cases, are still here. The land still holds what was placed in it, and what was placed in it is not exhausted. 10,000 years of human attention and intention and devotion, offered to a landscape that received it, without condition, and held it, without diminishment. That is an inheritance beyond any ordinary accounting. That is an underground river deeper and wider than any of us can fully take in. But we can touch it. We can approach its edges. We can, in quiet moments like this one, feel the slight current of it against the skin of our awareness and understand, without needing to fully articulate it, that we are not separate from what we stand on. That the land under our feet is not simply real estate or scenery or geology, that it is the other half of a conversation that has been going on for 10,000 years. We are the speaking half, the landscape is the listening half, or perhaps it is the other way around. Perhaps the landscape has always been speaking and we are only intermittently able to hear. Perhaps the question is less about what we say to it, and more about whether we become quiet enough to receive what it is saying. The Druids could hear it. Not perfectly, not always, not without years of training to develop the capacity, but they could hear it. And before them, the builders of the long barrows and the henges could hear it. And before them, the antler headdress people at the edge of the Yorkshire Lake could hear it. And now it is our turn. We have different training, different frameworks, different ideas about what is possible and what is real. But we have the same nervous systems, the same brains that have been paying attention to this landscape for 10,000 years, the same bodies that resonate with low-frequency sound in stone chambers, that feel the quality of spring water, that respond to the specific quality of light in a chalk downland, that become quiet in the presence of very old things. The tradition does not require you to believe anything. It requires you to notice, to pay the kind of attention that is humble enough to receive what is there rather than insisting on what you expected to find. To sit with a place long enough that the place begins to reveal itself rather than simply presenting its surface to a hurrying visitor. That is the invitation that has been extended from the very beginning of human presence in this landscape. That is the invitation the long barrows extend with their aligned entrances and their resonant chambers. That is the invitation the stone circles extend with their astronomical orientations and their specific placement in the landscape. That is the invitation the springs extend with their constant emergence from the apparent solidity of the ground. Come, be quiet, pay attention. What is here is worth attending to. The Druids knew this, and they went underground to preserve the knowing. And now it is surfacing again, in fragments and transformations and imperfect forms, but surfacing, finding its way back into the light. And that, perhaps, is the most hopeful thing about the story we have been following tonight. Not that the knowledge was preserved, though it was. Not that the tradition survived, though it did. But that the landscape itself never stopped being what it always was. That the quality that the first people in Britain recognized and responded to has not diminished across 10,000 years of human history, has not been depleted by all the attention that has been offered to it, has not been damaged by the centuries of disconnection and forgetting. It is still here, as fresh as it ever was, as deep as it ever was, as much itself as it ever was. The underground tradition is surfacing because the landscape is still here. The landscape is still presenting the same qualities it has always presented, to anyone willing to receive them. And when people encounter those qualities directly, without the mediation of an established tradition telling them what to find, they rediscover for themselves what the tradition has always known. They rediscover that the land is alive, that certain places in it are different from others, that attention given to those places returns transformed. This is not a rediscovery of the specific content of the Druidic teaching or the Neolithic cosmology. That specific content belongs to specific times and specific communities and cannot simply be recreated out of personal experience, however profound. But it is a rediscovery of the foundation on which that content was built, the direct perceptual encounter with the sacred landscape that preceded every articulation and every tradition and every monument. And from that foundation, in time, new forms of understanding can be built, new ways of articulating what the landscape offers, new practices for engaging with it productively, new communities for supporting and guiding the engagement. Not the same as what came before, because the circumstances are different and the people are different, and the frameworks available are different, but continuous with what came before, rooted in the same landscape, responding to the same qualities, drawing on the same deep tradition, even if the specific forms of that tradition have been largely lost. The underground river is not returning to the surface as the same river it was when it went underground. Rivers change as they flow through the earth. They pick up different minerals, different qualities, different temperatures from the rock they pass through. When they emerge, they carry something new as well as something old. And what emerges now from this long passage through the underground will not be the Druidic tradition as it was. It will be something that has passed through the underground for 2,000 years and come out changed by the passage. But it will still be the same river, still flowing from the same source, still carrying the fundamental recognition that is 10,000 years old. The recognition that this landscape is alive, that it speaks to those who have learned to listen, that what it says is worth preserving, worth transmitting, worth going underground to protect. The tradition has kept its word. It has kept what it was given. And now, slowly, imperfectly, it is giving it back to this landscape, to these hills and springs and stones, to the people who walk among them and sit with them and wonder what they were for and why they feel the way they feel, to the late-night listeners who are drawn to stories of deep time and ancient knowledge and the underground rivers of sacred tradition. To you. Let us talk about the specific people who have been drawn to these places in the period since the formal Druidic tradition was suppressed, because the story of who has been keeping the underground river alive, consciously or unconsciously, in the centuries between Roman Britain and the present day, is itself a remarkable story, and one that illuminates how traditions survive when they have no institutional support. The first thing to say is that the most important keepers of the tradition in the post-Roman period were not the learned, not the aristocratic, not the ecclesiastically connected. They were farmers, shepherds, people who worked the land for a living, who moved across it daily throughout the year, who knew the specific character of specific fields and hills and streams from the inside out, in the way that only someone who spends their working life in a landscape can know it. These people were not consciously maintaining a sacred tradition. They were simply maintaining their relationship with the land they worked, which was also, at a level they would not have articulated in those terms, a relationship with the accumulated sacred significance of that land. They knew where not to disturb the ground, not because an archaeologist had told them it was a scheduled monument, but because something in the local understanding said that this particular field, this particular hill, this particular spring was not ordinary, should be approached with a degree of respect, should not be casually altered or exploited without acknowledgement of what was there. Some of this took the form of superstition, in the pejorative sense of that word, of beliefs without explicit rationale that produce specific behaviors. Do not build on that mound. Do not divert that spring. Do not cut the old thorn tree that grows at the edge of that field. These injunctions, transmitted across generations of rural communities, long after anyone could explain their origin or rationale, are the folk memory of a tradition that once had explicit content and philosophical depth, but whose content and depth had been lost or suppressed. What remained was the behavior, the specific instruction about what to do or not do, without the understanding of why. But the behavior was enough. The mound was not built on. The spring was not diverted. The old thorn tree was not cut. And in these preserved behaviors, the basic structure of the sacred relationship between human community and specific places in the landscape was maintained, however incompletely and incomprehendingly. There are places in the British countryside today where this preservation has been so continuous and so effective that the physical character of the sacred site has been maintained across 2,000 years without any formal heritage protection or academic intervention. Springs that have been receiving offerings continuously from the pre-Roman period to the present. Hilltops that have never been farmed, maintained as common grazing or simply as open land, without any explicit awareness of their ancient significance, but also without any explicit decision to exploit them. Earthworks that have survived because of a persistent local feeling that to disturb them would bring bad luck. A folk rationalization of a much older understanding. This kind of preservation, imperfect and unconscious as it is, points towards something important about the relationship between landscape and tradition. The landscape is not passive in this relationship. It has its own ways of asserting its significance, not through supernatural intervention, but through the simple persistence of its specific qualities, which draw attention and generate response, even in people who have no explicit knowledge of the tradition associated with the place. People who have never heard of the Druids or the Neolithic or sacred geography still feel that certain places are different, still respond to that difference with a degree of care and attention that they might not be able to fully explain, still choose, in many cases, not to disturb places that feel as if they should not be disturbed. This is the landscape speaking in its own voice, in the voice of its specific qualities, its acoustic properties, its visual character, its relationship to water and light, and the biological communities that inhabit it. And in many cases, it is still being heard, however partially and imperfectly, by people who have no conscious framework for understanding what they are hearing. The tradition that the Druids went underground to protect is not dependent on the Druids or on any other formal institutional carrier for its ultimate survival. It is dependent on the landscape itself, and the landscape, as we have noted, is extraordinarily patient and extraordinarily persistent. It has been speaking for millions of years. The current difficulty of being heard, the noise and distraction and disconnection of modern life, is a very recent development in that very long history, and it is a development that the landscape can afford to wait out. But there are also people in the present moment who are not simply waiting for the landscape to be heard again, but actively working to restore the conditions in which it can be heard, working to recreate, in the terms available to the present moment, the kind of trained and careful attention that the Druidic tradition developed over its long history. Not recreating the Druidic tradition itself, which is impossible and would in any case be inappropriate given that we are not living in Iron Age Celtic Britain, but recreating the underlying capacity for the kind of engaged, receptive, humble attention to the sacred landscape that the tradition was designed to develop and maintain. This work takes many forms. Some of it is academic, the careful study of prehistoric sacred sites, the development of archaeoacoustics and archaeoastronomy and landscape archaeology as serious scholarly disciplines. Some of it is experiential, the direct engagement with sacred sites by people who visit them, not to photograph them or to tick them off a list, but to sit with them, to spend time in them, to learn what they have to offer to someone willing to offer them full attention. Some of it is creative. The landscape of Britain has continued to inspire art and music and poetry of extraordinary quality throughout the centuries of the underground tradition, and much of that creative work, at its best, is not simply about the landscape in the way that travel writing is about landscapes. It is from the landscape. It is the product of a deep attentional relationship with specific places that has allowed the artist to receive something from those places and transmit it in a form that others can encounter. The poetry of the Welsh tradition, for instance, carries within it structural features that are much older than the specific poems in which those features appear. The concept of hirith, that peculiarly Welsh form of longing that has no direct equivalent in English, the longing for a home or a belonging that may never have been directly experienced, but that is felt as real and as the truest orientation of the self, is a poetic expression of the very ancient recognition that the land is the other half of human being, that the correct relationship between a person and a landscape is one of belonging, of mutual recognition, of a kind of love that is not personal in the way that human love is personal, but is real in a way that is prior to and deeper than personal love. This recognition, carried in the Welsh poetic tradition across many centuries of displacement and cultural suppression, not unlike what the Druidic tradition experienced under Rome, is the underground river surfacing in poetry. It is the landscape speaking through the creative work of people who have been shaped by it, even when they cannot articulate in explicit terms what that shaping has done to them. The same current runs through many strands of British landscape writing, from the 17th century topographers who began to notice that the ancient monuments of Britain deserved serious attention, through the 18th and 19th century antiquarians and romantics who brought to the sacred landscape an attention that was not yet adequately informed by archaeology or by a proper understanding of the tradition being recovered, but that was genuine and that produced work of enduring value through the 20th and 21st century. Writers and artists who have found in the British landscape a depth that their contemporary cultural moment cannot adequately explain and cannot adequately dismiss. All of these are expressions of the underground river finding its way to the surface. Not the full flow, not the complete content of the tradition at its most articulate and most developed, but a current, a presence, a continuous threading of the ancient recognition through the surface of modern cultural life. And then there are the places themselves, the sites that, despite everything, despite centuries of neglect and occasional damage, and the overwhelming noise of modern civilization, still hold what was placed in them, still offer what they have always offered, still extend the invitation that was first extended 10,000 years ago to the first people who recognized what was there. Avebury is still there, Silbury Hill is still there, the long barrows of the Cotswolds and the Chalk Downs are still there, the springs of Bath and Glastonbury and hundreds of lesser-known but equally ancient sites are still flowing. Stonehenge is still standing, and dozens of other sites, less famous, less visited, less studied, but no less ancient and no less powerful in the specific way that ancient sacred sites in this landscape are powerful, are still here too. They are accessible. You can visit them. You can sit in them and with them. You can give them the kind of attention that they have been designed, over thousands of years of human engagement, to receive and to respond to. That is perhaps the most important thing to say. Not that the tradition is lost and must be recovered. Not that the knowledge is hidden and must be found, but that the places themselves are still here, still accessible, still waiting, and that the kind of engagement they require is not complicated and not exclusive. It is simply a particular quality of human attention, offered honestly and without demand, in a specific place, over a sufficient length of time. That is all that is required. That is all that has ever been required. The Druids knew this. The Neolithic builders knew this. The antler headdress people at Starkar knew this. And the landscape itself, in its patient and inexhaustible way, has been demonstrating it for 10,000 years. Come, be quiet, pay attention. What is here has been waiting for exactly this. And now, as we approach the end of our time together in this story, let us return to the beginning, to the moment before the Druids arrived, to the landscape of Britain in the period before any formal tradition had names for what it held. When the first people walked through a world that was still taking shape after the last ice age, when the chalk downs were white and fresh and the springs that still flow today were just beginning to find their paths to the surface, when the first human eyes in this landscape looked up at the stars and down at the ground and felt the connection between them, when the first human feet found the places that were different and the first human hands began to mark those places, that is where the tradition begins. Not with the Druids who came later, or with the Neolithic builders who came later still in the long perspective of the Mesolithic, but with the simple, primal, utterly human act of noticing that some places are different and that the difference deserves acknowledgement. The acknowledgement is still happening. All around you, in this night, in this landscape, if you are in Britain or in the landscape wherever you are, that acknowledgement is still happening in the unconscious preservation of ancient places by communities who cannot explain why they care for them, in the art and poetry and music that carries the landscape's voice into the wider culture, in the personal experiences of people who find themselves drawn to ancient places by something they cannot name, in the quiet work of researchers and practitioners who are trying, each in their own way, to restore the conditions for the kind of attention that the sacred landscape deserves. The underground river is not gone. It has never been gone. It has simply been, in different periods and to different degrees, harder to find and harder to recognize. But it is there. It was there before the Druids, and it will be there after us. It will be there because the landscape that it flows from is there, patient and ancient and absolutely inexhaustible in its willingness to offer what it has always offered. Whatever scared the Druids underground, whatever made them protect this knowledge with such extraordinary care across such extraordinary lengths of time, whatever made the Neolithic builders invest 500,000 man-hours in a single mound and 1,000 years of collective effort in a single monument complex, whatever made the first people in this landscape stop their hunting and their gathering and stand still at a spring or on a hilltop and know with a certainty that no argument could shake, that they were in the presence of something worth responding to. That thing is still here, not diminished, not exhausted, not tired of being itself. Still here, as present as it has ever been, as ready to meet us as it has always been ready to meet anyone who comes to it in the right way. Sleep well tonight, dream of chalk hills and clear springs, and old stones standing in their circles under the same stars that have wheeled above them for 5,000 years. Dream of the antler headdress people by their lake, and the long barrow builders, and the Druids in their groves, and the countless unnamed people in between who kept the tradition alive simply by continuing to pay attention to the landscape they lived in. You are part of that tradition, whether you know it or not. Whether you have ever visited a sacred site or read a book about prehistoric Britain or given any of this a moment's thought before tonight, you are part of it because you are human, and because being human in this landscape means being part of the longest conversation that has ever been held in these islands. The conversation between human consciousness and the sacred landscape of Britain. That conversation is still going. Tonight, in this quiet, in your willingness to listen to this story about what was here before the Druids and what went underground and what is still flowing, you are joining it. You are taking your place in a line of people who have sat with this landscape and wondered about it and tried to understand it. That stretches back 10,000 years. Welcome to the tradition. You have always been part of it. There is one more thread to follow before this night is done. One more direction the underground river flows that we have not yet traced fully. And it takes us in a direction that might seem surprising, away from the hills and springs and stone circles of Britain, and toward a question that the British tradition shares with traditions from much further afield. The question of why. Not why specific monuments were built, not why specific places were considered sacred, but the deeper why. Why does any of this matter? Why, across 10,000 years of human history in Britain, across every disruption and suppression and cultural shift, have people kept returning to this question of the sacred landscape? What need does it meet in the human being that cannot be met any other way? The answer, if there is one, is not theological. It is not about what you believe happens after you die, or who created the universe, or what supernatural powers govern the world. It is about something more basic than any of those things. It is about the experience of belonging. Human beings are the only creatures who regularly experience the sense that they do not belong. Other animals live entirely within their environment, embedded in it, continuous with it, never stepping back far enough from it to wonder whether they fit. But human beings, with their self-conscious intelligence and their capacity for abstraction and their ability to construct mental models of themselves and their world, can experience themselves as separate from everything around them, can feel, in certain conditions, completely alone in a universe that does not know or care about their existence. This experience, which modern psychology identifies as one of the most fundamental sources of human suffering, is not a product of modernity. It is as old as self-consciousness itself. It is the inevitable shadow of the human capacity for abstraction. The same cognitive gift that allows us to plan and to create and to understand also allows us to feel radically, existentially alone. The sacred landscape tradition of Britain is, among other things, a direct response to this experience. It is a tradition organized around the recognition that the experience of radical separateness is not accurate, that the human being is not in fact separate from the landscape or from the great time or from the consciousness that participates in the world at every level, that the experience of separateness is a function of attention, specifically of the ordinary waking attention that is organized around the needs and projects of the individual self, and that therefore systematically underweights everything that lies outside those needs and projects. The practices associated with the sacred landscape, the practices that the Druids were trained in, and that the Neolithic builders were enacting through their monuments, are practices for shifting attention, for moving from the mode of attention that is organized around the individual self to the mode of attention that is organized around the relationship between the individual and the world, from the mode that produces the experience of separateness to the mode that produces the experience of belonging. And the experience of belonging, when it occurs in the right place, with the right preparation, with the right quality of attention, is not simply a pleasant feeling. It is a revelation. It reveals something about the structure of reality that the ordinary mode of attention systematically conceals. It reveals that the individual self, real as it is and important as it is not the primary unit of reality. It is an expression of a larger reality, an expression that is temporary and particular, but continuous with everything else that the larger reality expresses. This is not a teaching that can be adequately conveyed in words. It is an experience. And the tradition that went underground with the Druids was, at its core, a tradition of how to create the conditions for that experience in a specific landscape at a specific latitude under specific skies. The landscape of Britain is particularly suited to this kind of experience for reasons that we have already touched on. The quality of the light, the presence of water, the ancient geological formations, the specific acoustic properties of the chalk and limestone landscapes, the extraordinary variety of sky. All of these contribute to an environment that is, in specific places at specific times, almost impossibly beautiful in the way that beauty can shatter the ordinary sense of self and reveal the more continuous reality beneath it. The builders of the monuments knew this. They worked with the specific qualities of the landscape to create focal points for this kind of beauty, places where the ordinary tendency of the natural world to produce the shattering beauty was enhanced and concentrated by the specific work of human hands and human intention. The chambers that resonated with exactly the frequency, most likely to shift neurological state. The alignments that brought the light of the solstice sun through a narrow entrance into an otherwise dark interior, creating a moment of sudden, overwhelming illumination. The avenues of stones that guided movement through the landscape in ways that built towards specific moments of perceptual intensity. All of these were technologies of experience, technologies for creating the conditions in which the revelation of belonging was most likely to occur. And the revelation was not a private experience, available only to the specially trained initiate undergoing a formal ritual. It was an experience available to anyone who participated in the collective practices that the monument supported, available to the farmer who walked the stone avenue on the morning of the solstice, to the child who played in the shadow of the long barrow, to the elder who sat at the entrance to the chamber and listened to the resonance that the chamber produced from the sounds of their voice. The tradition was not exclusive. The experience it offered was not the preserve of specialists. The specialists, The priests and the wise people, and eventually the Druids, were simply the people who had developed the most refined capacity for the experience and who could therefore guide and facilitate it most effectively for others. This democratizing impulse, the sense that the sacred is not the preserve of specialists, but is available in principle to anyone willing to engage with it honestly, is one of the most important features of the British tradition at its best, and it is a feature that the underground tradition preserved even through the periods when institutional religion was most insistent on the opposite, on the idea that the sacred is mediated through specific authorized human intermediaries and cannot be directly encountered by ordinary people. The holy wells of rural Britain, the persistence of people leaving offerings at springs and sacred trees and standing stones throughout the Christian period, the refusal of ordinary people to stop going to places their church told them had no sacred power. All of this is evidence of the democratic impulse of the original tradition, maintaining itself against institutional pressure. The landscape was available to everyone. The sacred it held was available to everyone. And the people who lived in that landscape continued to engage with it, on their own terms, in their own way, without needing institutional permission or institutional guidance. The underground tradition is democratic in its deepest nature. It does not belong to the Druids or to any other specialist class. It belongs to the landscape, and through the landscape, to anyone willing to engage with the landscape honestly. The Druids were its most sophisticated expression, but they were not its owners, and the tradition did not die with the Druids because the landscape did not die with the Druids. This is the final thing to say about what was in Britain before the Druids. It was the landscape itself. It was the specific quality of the British landscape, the specific qualities of light and water and stone and sky that drew and held and shaped human attention across 10,000 years of successive cultures. Every tradition that inhabited this landscape found the same thing. Every tradition that took the time to pay attention discovered the same qualities, responded to them in its own way, left its own mark in the ground, and added its own layer to the accumulated sacred significance of the places it engaged with. The Druids were the most articulate expression of a response that had been accumulating for thousands of years before them. But the response itself, the basic human recognition of what this landscape holds and offers, that is older than any articulation. That is as old as the first human foot on British soil, and it is as present tonight as it was then. The land has not changed. The springs have not forgotten. The stones have not moved from where they were placed. And whatever quality it is that this landscape holds, the quality that made the antler headdress people choose that specific lake edge for their ceremony, that made the long barrow builders choose those specific hilltops for their monuments, that made the henge builders choose those specific locations for their enormous earthworks, that made the Druids spend 20 years of their lives learning to be present to it, that made every generation in between keep returning to the same places, even when the explicit knowledge of why those places mattered had been lost. That quality is still here, tonight, in whatever landscape surrounds you, in whatever quiet has settled around the sound of this voice. The land remembers. The springs still flow, the stones still stand, and the underground river is always looking for somewhere to surface. Consider for a moment the specific texture of winter in a chalk landscape. It is unlike winter anywhere else in Britain. The chalk is white to begin with, and in certain light, certain conditions of frost and low sun, the bare downland takes on a quality that is genuinely disorienting in the best possible sense. The boundaries between things become unclear. The horizon is sometimes invisible. The sky and the ground meeting in the same pale luminosity. And the shadows, when they appear, are the darkest shadows you will see anywhere in the British landscape. Deep purple-blue cuts across the white that have an almost physical weight to them. The people who chose to build their most significant monuments in chalk landscapes were responding to this quality, among others. They were choosing a material, chalk, that changes appearance more dramatically under different conditions of light than almost any other rock, and they were choosing locations in that material where the specific drama of chalk in different lights would be most intense. The long barrows on the crest of chalk ridges, exposed to the full play of sky and shadow, catch every mood the sky presents. On a clear winter morning, they glow with a cold fire. In the rain, they darken to the colour of old bone. At dusk in summer, they hold the colour of the sky long after the sky itself has moved on. These are not accidental aesthetic effects. The people who built these monuments were sophisticated observers of the natural world, and they chose their materials and their locations with the full knowledge of what those choices would produce across different seasons and different conditions of light. The long barrow that glows on a winter morning was placed there to glow on a winter morning by people who had watched that hill crest through many winters and knew exactly what the dawn light would do to white chalk in the cold, clear air of February. And the glow was not simply beautiful, though it was certainly beautiful, it was meaningful. In a landscape where everything else in winter is grey or brown, or the exhausted green of dormant grass, a structure that glows with apparent internal fire at first light carries an obvious message about the relationship between the structure and the light. It catches the dawn. It holds the dawn. It becomes, in that moment, an embodiment of the dawn, rather than simply an object illuminated by it. The ancestors who rest in that mound, in whatever sense the pre-Druidic tradition understood the ancestors to rest, are participating in the dawn, are part of its emergence, are as continuous with the light as the chalk itself is continuous with the light. The monument does not separate the dead from the living world. It weaves them into it. It makes them participants in the daily drama of light and dark, sky and earth, warmth and cold, that governs the life of every creature in the landscape. This is a theological position of considerable sophistication. The dead are not gone from the world. They are not in a separate realm waiting for judgment or liberation or rebirth. They are here, present in the landscape, participating in its life, available to the living who know how to engage with the specific places where that participation is most accessible. And the monument, the glowing white mound on the winter hilltop, makes that participation visible, makes it impossible to ignore, makes it a daily fact rather than a theological speculation. The Christianity that eventually overlaid the pre-Druidic tradition of Britain was not entirely incompatible with this understanding, which is perhaps one reason why the transition was not as complete or as rapid as the Church would have preferred. The Christian understanding of the resurrection of the dead, the continuing participation of the faithful departed in the life of the living Church, the intercessory power of the saints who stand between the human and the divine, all of these have a family resemblance to the pre-Druidic understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead. The specific theology is different. The cosmological framework is different. But the fundamental recognition that death is not a complete removal from the relational world, that the dead continue to participate in some sense in the life of the living, that specific places and specific practices can make that participation accessible. All of this is common ground, which is perhaps why the Church chose to absorb the sacred wells and the sacred hilltops rather than simply suppressing them. The places were already understood to be places where the membrane between the ordinary world and whatever lay beyond it was thin. The Church did not need to dispute that understanding. It simply needed to rename what lay beyond the membrane in its own terms. And in the naming, much was preserved. Not the pre-Druidic cosmology, not the specific understanding of the three great insights that the underground tradition was carrying, but the physical infrastructure of engagement, the wells and the hilltops and the specific places in the landscape that had been identified over thousands of years as having the quality that rewarded engaged attention. Those were preserved even through the Christian period, Because the church preserved them, built its chapels near the sacred wells, built its churches on the sacred hilltops, dedicated its pilgrimage routes to the same springs that had received offerings for thousands of years before the first British Christian was baptized. This is continuity of a very interesting kind, not continuity of explicit content, of the specific cosmological understanding that the tradition carried, but continuity of place, of infrastructure, of the basic map of the sacred landscape. The map that had been drawn over thousands of years of observation and engagement and monument building was preserved in transformed but still recognizable form by the very institution that officially opposed the tradition from which the map came. The landscape won. That is the simplest way to put it. The landscape, with its specific qualities and its specific places and its 10,000-year history of drawing human attention and holding human response, proved more durable than any cultural or institutional attempt to deny or redirect what it held. The churches were built on the hilltops because the hilltops were already understood as sacred, and denying that sacredness entirely would have made the churches seem less, rather than more, authoritative. So the hilltops were incorporated rather than rejected, the sacredness reattributed rather than dismissed, and in the process the map of the sacred landscape was preserved. This is the underground river's greatest trick, not hiding, not disguising itself, but allowing itself to be covered over by successive layers of interpretation and attribution, while the physical infrastructure, the actual places in the actual landscape, continues unchanged beneath all of those layers. You can peel the layers back. It requires some knowledge and some willingness to look past the obvious surface. But the layers are not deep. The spring at Bath is still flowing with the same water that flowed through the Roman baths and that received offerings before the Romans arrived. The chalk hilltops are still where they always were. The long barrows and the stone circles that survive are accessible to anyone with the physical ability to reach them and the willingness to sit with them quietly for long enough to receive what they offer. That is the inheritance that 10,000 years of underground tradition has preserved and is now offering back to anyone willing to accept it. Not a theology, not a set of mandatory beliefs or practices, not membership in a tradition that requires initiation and training and 20 years of dedicated preparation. Simply the invitation to engage honestly and attentively with the specific places in the landscape that have been drawing honest and attentive engagement for 10,000 years. The invitation is open. It has always been open. The places are there. The quality they hold is there. The willingness to meet you, if you come honestly and without demand and with the simple readiness to receive what is there rather than what you came expecting to find, that willingness is there too. It was there before the Druids. It was there when the Druids came. It remained when the Druids went underground. And it is there now, tonight, in whatever landscape is outside the window of wherever you are listening to this. The underground river is always surfacing, always finding its way back to the light, always offering itself to anyone willing to notice it. Tonight, you noticed it. That is enough. There is a rhythm to the sacred landscape of Britain that you can learn to feel if you spend enough time in it. Not the rhythm of the seasons, though that is part of it. Not the rhythm of the tides, though in coastal landscapes that is part of it too. The rhythm I am pointing toward is subtler than either of these and operates at a different scale. It is the rhythm of deep time, the slow oscillation of warmth and cold, presence and absence, fullness and emptiness, that has been governing the character of this landscape since long before human beings arrived to notice it. The Ice Ages are the most dramatic expression of this rhythm. Britain has been covered in ice sheets several times in the last million years, the ice advancing from the north and the mountains, obliterating the surface expression of everything that came before it, scraping the bedrock clean, depositing enormous quantities of glacial material in patterns determined by the specific character of each ice advance, then retreating and leaving behind a landscape so thoroughly reshaped that the next inhabitants would find a world almost entirely different from the one that preceded the ice. Each interglacial period, each warm period between glaciations, has been a period of rapid recolonization, of plant communities and animal communities and human communities moving back into the newly exposed landscape and establishing new relationships with the new terrain. The chalk and limestone uplands of the south were among the first areas to be recolonized after the last glaciation because they drain quickly and warm quickly and produce the kinds of grassland communities that support large grazing animals. And where the large grazing animals go, the human hunters who follow them go. The people who arrived in southern Britain 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age were not arriving in an unfamiliar landscape. They were the descendants of people who had been in Britain, on and off for several 100,000 years, moving with the ice margins, retreating south when the ice advanced, returning when it retreated. They knew this kind of landscape. Their cultural and biological inheritance included accumulated knowledge of how to live in these specific conditions, how to read these specific skies and these specific soils and these specific patterns of animal movement. And they brought with them, in their oral traditions and their practices and their understanding of what places in a landscape deserve attention, the accumulated sacred knowledge of a very long relationship with the landscape of Northern Europe and Britain. A relationship interrupted repeatedly by the ice, but never entirely broken, because the ice pushed people south rather than eliminating them, and the southern refugia, where people waited out the glacial maxima, were themselves landscapes with their own sacred geography that the underground tradition incorporated and carried forward. This is why the sacred tradition of Britain is not simply a product of the most recent human occupation of these islands. It is the product of a relationship that has been building, with interruptions, for hundreds of thousands of years. Each new wave of inhabitants bringing their own understanding and their own practices into relationship with what was already here, adding their own layer to the accumulated significance of specific places in a landscape that has been recognized as significant for longer than any cultural memory can directly reach. The underground river is deep in a way that goes beyond the 10,000 years of the most recent continuous occupation. Its sources are deeper than that. They extend back into the Paleolithic, into the first human encounters with this landscape, in the warm periods before the last glaciation. They extend back to a time when Britain was not an island, but a peninsula of northwest Europe. When you could walk from what is now London to what is now Paris, without getting your feet wet. When the sacred geography of Britain was continuous with the sacred geography of a much larger territory. All of that is background. All of that is the depth from which the underground river flows. The Druids were not aware of most of it in explicit terms, because the explicit tradition could only reach back so far. But they were aware of something. They were aware that the places they engaged with were not simply ancient by the standards of their own recent cultural history. They were ancient in a way that preceded any cultural history they could access. They were ancient in the way that the land itself is ancient, in a way that goes beyond the reach of any oral tradition, and that is felt rather than known, registered by the body in those places before the mind has a chance to name or categorize it. That felt antiquity, that bodily sense of being in the presence of something enormously old. That is what the underground tradition was protecting and transmitting, not the specific cosmological content, though that was important and was transmitted too, but the direct encounter with that felt antiquity, the experience of touching time so deep that your ordinary sense of self becomes very small and very recent in comparison. That encounter is available in Britain in a way that it is available in very few other places in the world, not because the other places do not have deep time. Every landscape has deep time, but because the specific combination of geological antiquity and continuous human engagement and preserved sacred infrastructure and accessible sacred sites makes the encounter with deep time more available in Britain than almost anywhere else. You can stand in a long barrow that is 5,000 years old. You can stand in a hilltop enclosure that may be 8,000 years old. You can stand at a spring that has been receiving human offerings for 3,000 years at minimum. And in each case, you can feel, if you are quiet enough and attentive enough, the weight of all that time. Not abstractly, as a number of years, but as a quality of the place, a pressure, a depth, a sense that the moment you are in is embedded in something vastly larger than the moment. That is the gift. That is what the tradition has been preserving across all these generations and all these disruptions and all these attempts to suppress or redirect or ignore it. The gift of being able to feel where you actually are, not just in space, but in time, in the great time, in the river of moments that began before memory and will continue after everything any of us knows. The underground tradition went to extraordinary lengths to preserve the conditions for this gift. The Druids spent 20 years in training to develop the capacity to receive it. The Neolithic builders moved millions of cubic meters of material to create the physical infrastructure for it. The Mesolithic hunters chose specific places in the landscape and returned to them across generations because of it. And now it is offered to you, not requiring 20 years of training, not requiring the movement of a single stone, only requiring the willingness to go to a specific place in the landscape and be quiet and pay honest attention. That is all. That is the whole of the tradition in its most essential form. Go to the place. Be quiet. Pay attention. The place will do the rest. And with that, the night is drawing on. The story has come full circle, from the first people who felt the quality of this landscape and responded to it, through the long accumulation of sacred tradition and monument building and oral transmission, through the Druids who articulated and preserved the tradition at its most sophisticated, through the going underground under Roman pressure, through the centuries of partial and imperfect preservation in folk practice and holy wells and persistent local knowledge, through the slow surfacing that is happening now, and back to the simple, original recognition that underlies all of it. The land is alive, certain places in it are different, and the difference rewards attention. 10,000 years of tradition, one essential insight. Still here, still available, still waiting for anyone willing to notice. One last thought before the night takes you fully. The people who built Stonehenge, the people who carried bluestones from Wales and raised the Sarsen trilithons and aligned the whole complex to the midsummer sunrise, those people were not doing something that was complete when they set the last stone. They were doing something that was only beginning. The monument was not the end of the work. It was the beginning of a relationship between that place and every human being who would ever stand there and look toward the solstice sunrise. Every person who has ever been at Stonehenge at dawn on the longest day of the year has been part of what those builders began. The monument includes them. The tradition includes them. The underground river carries them forward along with everything else it carries. And tonight it carries you. The tradition asks nothing of you that you cannot give. It does not require belief. It does not require pilgrimage to specific places, though that helps. It does not require initiation into any group or acceptance of any authority. It requires only what the landscape itself requires of anyone who wants to receive what it holds. Presence. Quiet. Honest attention given freely, without demand for a specific result. Give that to the land tonight, even if only in your imagination, even if only in the space between waking and sleep, and receive in return whatever the land has to give. The underground river does not care what you call it, or whether you have a framework for understanding it. It simply flows. It has always simply flowed, and it will still be flowing long after this night is over, and you have carried whatever it gave you into the next day, and the next, and whatever comes after. The chalk is still white on the hills. The springs are still cold and clear and rising from depths that no one has fully mapped. The stones are still standing in their circles and their rows and their solitary positions on ridgelines and in valley heads, patient as only stone can be patient. And the underground river is still flowing, under all of it, carrying the oldest knowledge in the oldest tradition in this landscape toward whatever surface it will find, in whatever generation is ready to receive it. Tonight, that generation is you. Good night, sleep well. The land remembers everything. I appreciate you listening. If you enjoyed this journey, drop a comment. I always read them. Let me know where you are tonight and what time it is there.